In 1884, a massive stone building stood alone on the edge of Manhattan. It rose 8 stories high on a stretch of land that most people called wilderness. Empty lots surrounded it on every side. Goat pastures stretched toward the Hudson River. Wooden shacks dotted the rocky ground. A few dirt roads cut through the open spaces. Critics looked at this strange fortress and laughed. They called it madness. They called it a waste of money. They gave it a cruel nickname that stuck for years. They called it Clark's Folly. The man who built it, they said, had lost his mind. No wealthy family would ever live so far from civilization. No respectable person would choose to live in an apartment. The building would stand empty forever, they predicted. It would become a monument to foolish dreams. Within 5 years, every single apartment was occupied. There was a waiting list of families hoping to move in. The building that skeptics mocked had become the most desired address in all of New York City. This is the story of how 3 remarkable buildings changed the way wealthy Americans chose to live. It is a tale of vision and scandal, of fortunes made from unexpected sources, of men who saw the future when others saw only the past. The money that built these palaces came from sewing machines, from mining fortunes, from men willing to risk everything on an idea. One fortune was built by a man who maintained 4 separate families at the same time. Another came from a family that dug minerals from the earth. The third belonged to brothers who understood that quality would always find buyers. These men looked at crowded Manhattan and saw opportunity. They looked at wealthy families struggling to maintain private mansions and saw a better way. They imagined buildings where the rich could live with every comfort of a private home but none of the burden. They dreamed of apartment palaces where luxury meant freedom, not responsibility. Before these buildings existed, such a thing seemed impossible. The very wealthy lived in private townhouses along Fifth Avenue. They employed armies of servants. They maintained stables for their horses and carriages. They heated their homes with coal furnaces that required constant attention. They worried about pipes freezing in winter and roofs leaking in spring. They dealt with endless problems that came with owning a large home. Apartments were for poor people. Apartments meant cramped rooms in buildings without elevators. Apartments meant sharing walls with strangers and hearing their every sound. Apartments meant loss of privacy and loss of social standing. No person of quality would consider such a thing. But 3 remarkable buildings would change all of that. They would prove that apartments could be more luxurious than mansions. They would show that sharing a building with neighbors could mean gaining services impossible in a private home. They would demonstrate that the future of city living did not require giving up comfort or status. The first of these buildings rose in the 1880s on the far edge of the city. The second appeared 20 years later in a blaze of publicity and scandal. The third arrived in 1930, just as the nation plunged into the worst economic crisis in its history. Together they transformed not just New York but every American city that came after. If you find this story fascinating, take a moment to subscribe to support the channel. It means a lot. And I also welcome you to share your opinions in the comments below. The Dakota began as an insult, a joke about a building so far from society it might as well be in the Dakota Territory out west. The Ansonia became famous for excess and scandal, for rooftop farms and opera singers and wild parties. The San Remo perfected the model with twin towers that defined the New York skyline and a tenant selection process so strict that even the famous were turned away. But before any of these buildings could exist, the men who would create them had to overcome powerful resistance. They had to challenge every assumption about how wealthy people should live, and they had to risk enormous fortunes on ideas that nearly everyone thought would fail. In the 1870s, respectable New Yorkers did not live in apartments. The very idea was shocking to people of quality and breeding. Wealthy families occupied private homes in fashionable neighborhoods. They lived in brick town houses along Fifth Avenue, in brownstone mansions in Murray Hill, in elegant homes with front stoops and back gardens. These homes were symbols of success and social position. A man who owned his own house could display his taste and wealth for all to see. He could choose his neighbors by choosing his neighborhood. He could control who entered his door and who did not. His home was his castle, and every successful businessman wanted a castle of his own. Living in such a house required enormous resources. A typical wealthy household employed 10 to 20 servants. There were cooks and maids, butlers and footmen, coachmen and stable hands, gardeners and laundresses. Each servant needed a place to sleep and food to eat. Managing them all required constant attention and significant expense. The house itself demanded endless maintenance. Furnaces needed coal delivered and ashes removed every single day during winter. Gas lights required regular attention from specialists. Plumbing froze and burst, roofs leaked, paint peeled, wood rotted, fires were a constant danger. Theft was a constant worry. The list of problems never ended. Even the wealthiest families found home ownership exhausting, but there seemed to be no alternative. Renting was for people without money. Apartments were for immigrants crowded into the Lower East Side, for working families packed into buildings without proper light or air, for people who had no choice. The idea that a banker or railroad president might share a building with strangers was simply unthinkable. It suggested poverty. It suggested failure. It suggested that a man could not afford to maintain his own establishment. In America, where every man was supposed to rise as high as his talents would take him, living in an apartment felt like admission of defeat. But Europe was different. In Paris, wealthy families had lived in grand apartment buildings for generations. They occupied entire floors of elegant structures along the wide boulevards. They employed private servants within their own apartments. They enjoyed shared courtyards and professional building management, and they did all of this without any loss of social position. The same was true in London, in Vienna, in Berlin. The finest families in Europe saw nothing wrong with apartment living. They understood that sharing a building did not mean sharing their private lives. They appreciated the convenience of professional management and shared services. They recognized that urban land was too valuable to waste on single-family homes. Why should New York be different? The city was growing faster than any in history. Land values on Manhattan Island were climbing higher every year. By 1870, an empty lot in a good neighborhood might cost more than a working man would earn in a lifetime. The cost of maintaining a private mansion had become absurd even for the very rich. Surely there was a market for something new. Surely some wealthy families would welcome an alternative to the endless burden of home ownership. Surely someone could build apartments elegant enough to satisfy the pride of the rich and comfortable enough to make them forget they were sharing a building with neighbors. Others had already tested the idea on a small scale. In 1869, a building called the Stuyvesant opened on East 18th Street near Irving Place. The architect Richard Morris Hunt had designed it for middle-class families of good reputation. It offered modest apartments with modern conveniences. It had steam heat and gas lighting. It had proper kitchens and bathrooms. It had an elevator to carry residents to upper floors. The Stuyvesant succeeded beyond expectations. Respectable merchants and professional men moved their families into the building. They discovered they liked apartment living. They appreciated not worrying about furnaces and roofs. They enjoyed having neighbors nearby. They found the building comfortable and convenient. The success of the Stuyvesant inspired imitators. Other developers built apartment houses for the middle class. By the mid-1870s, dozens of such buildings stood in Manhattan. They proved that Americans would accept apartment living if the apartments were nice enough. But all of these buildings targeted people of moderate means. Nobody had yet dared to build luxury apartments for the truly wealthy. The reason was simple. The rich had choices. They could afford private homes. They did not need to compromise. Any apartment building aimed at wealthy tenants would have to offer something better than what they already had. It would have to provide more comfort, more convenience, more luxury than a private mansion. And it would have to do all of this while somehow preserving the privacy and social standing that the wealthy demanded. This seemed impossible. How could an apartment ever rival a mansion? How could shared living ever satisfy people accustomed to complete control? How could any building overcome decades of prejudice against apartments? One man believed he had the answer. His name was Edward Clark. He was 64 years old in 1875, and he had just become one of the richest men in America. His fortune came from sewing machines, from a business partnership with one of the most scandalous men of the 19th century. Now Clark was ready to spend that fortune on an idea that everyone told him would fail. Edward Clark was everything his business partner was not. Born in 1811 in Athens, New York, he grew up in a respectable middle-class family. He studied law and built a solid practice in upstate New York. In 1831, he married Caroline Jordan, and he remained faithful to her until her death decades later. He was careful, conservative, and utterly devoted to order and stability. Clark believed in planning and patience. He believed in building systems that would last. He believed that careful management could overcome almost any obstacle. Where other men saw chaos, Clark saw opportunities for organization. Where others rushed forward, Clark studied and prepared. For more than 20 years, Clark had managed a business that made him wealthy beyond imagination. He had turned a mechanical invention into an industrial empire. He had created new ways of selling products that changed American commerce forever. He had proven that he understood business better than almost anyone alive. Now Clark was looking for a new challenge. He had watched European cities for years during his business travels abroad. He had seen how wealthy Parisians lived in grand apartment buildings without shame or social penalty. He had studied how those buildings were designed and managed. He had learned what worked and what did not. Clark believed the same model could work in New York. He believed that wealthy Americans would abandon their burdensome mansions if offered something better. He believed that luxury apartments could succeed if they were grand enough and well managed enough, and he was willing to risk his fortune to prove it. But Clark was not a reckless man. Before attempting anything grand, he wanted to test his ideas on a smaller scale. In 1879, he hired an architect named Henry Hardenberg to design an apartment building on 7th Avenue near 55th Street. The building was called the Van Corlear. It cost about $8,000 per apartment to construct. The Van Corlear targeted solid middle-class families, not the truly wealthy, but it was well built and nicely finished. It offered good-sized apartments with modern conveniences, and it succeeded. Respectable tenants moved in and stayed. The building proved that careful design and good management could attract quality residents. Encouraged by this success, Clark decided to attempt something far more ambitious. He would build luxury apartments specifically for wealthy families currently living in private mansions. He would create something so grand, so comfortable, so well-serviced that even the richest New Yorkers would choose to live there. He would prove once and for all that apartment living could work in America. The site he selected shocked everyone who heard about it. Rather than building in a fashionable neighborhood where the wealthy already lived, Clark bought land on the far edge of the city. He purchased a large lot at the corner of 72nd Street and 8th Avenue, in a section of Manhattan that barely qualified as a neighborhood at all. In 1880, the Upper West Side was not a place where respectable people lived. It was frontier territory within the city limits. The land west of Central Park remained largely undeveloped. Rocky outcrops broke through the ground. Wooden shacks dotted the landscape. Some plots still functioned as small farms or pasture land for goats and pigs. A few better houses stood here and there, but they were isolated outposts in a sea of emptiness. The contrast with the Upper East Side could not have been more dramatic. East of Central Park, elegant brownstones lined the streets. Wealthy families had rushed to build there as soon as the park opened in the 1860s. The neighborhood had everything rich people wanted. It had nearby shops and churches. It had other wealthy families for neighbors. It had social life and convenient access to downtown. The West Side had none of these things. It felt like another world entirely, a rough and unfinished place where no person of quality would choose to live. The few people who did live there were mostly working-class families or recent immigrants. There were no fine shops, no proper churches, no gas streetlights, no paved sidewalks. Getting downtown required either a long walk or an uncomfortable ride on a horse-drawn omnibus. This was where Edward Clark chose to build his apartment palace. This was where he would risk $2 million and his entire reputation. Critics immediately began calling his project a folly. The name stuck and spread. Newspapers picked it up. People gossiped about it at dinner parties. Clark's folly became the joke of the season, but Clark saw what others missed. He saw that the Upper West Side would not remain empty forever. The city was growing too fast. Land downtown had become too expensive. Development would eventually spread in every direction. The question was not whether the West Side would develop, but who would be first to build for its future residents. Clark also understood something important about transportation. In 1879, the 9th Avenue Elevated Railway had finally reached the Upper West Side. This new train line ran on tracks raised high above the street. It connected the remote neighborhoods far uptown with the business districts many miles to the south. For the first time, residents of the Upper West Side could reach downtown in less than 30 minutes. This changed everything. With reliable rapid transit now available, the area's isolation seemed less permanent. People could live far uptown and still conduct business downtown. They could maintain social connections across the city. They could enjoy cheaper land and more open space without sacrificing access to work and society. Clark had another insight as well. He understood that not everyone who could afford luxury actually wanted the burden of maintaining a private mansion. Running a large household was exhausting work. It required hiring and managing many servants. It required constant attention to endless problems. It required significant time and energy that successful people might prefer to spend on other things. The very wealthy would always want private estates, but people of more moderate fortune, professionals and merchants who had done well but were not truly rich, might welcome an alternative. They might appreciate the chance to live in luxury without the responsibility. They might enjoy having professional staff handle all maintenance and repairs. They might like the convenience of building services they could never afford on their own. This was Clark's gamble. He would build the finest apartment house in America on the most unlikely site he could find. He would spare no expense on quality and design. He would offer services that no private home could match, and he would prove that the skeptics were wrong. For his architect, Clark chose the same man who had designed the Van Corlear. Henry Hardenberg was young, only 33 years old, but he had already proven himself capable. More importantly, he had studied European architecture. He understood how to design buildings that felt substantial and permanent. He knew how to create spaces that satisfied wealthy families. Clark gave Hardenberg clear instructions. The new building should be unlike anything New York had ever seen. It should look important and impressive from the outside. Inside, it should offer apartments as spacious and comfortable as private homes. It should have every modern convenience available, and it should be built to last for centuries. Money was no object. Where the Van Corlear had cost $8,000 per apartment, this new building would cost $25,000 per unit. That was 3 times as much, an enormous sum at a time when a working family might earn $500 in an entire year. Construction would take years. Costs would climb even higher than projected. And tragically, Edward Clark would never see his dream completed. But the building he created would prove him right about everything. It would change American cities forever. The fortune that made all of this possible came from one of the most scandalous men in 19th century America. His name was Isaac Merritt Singer, and his personal life was chaos from beginning to end. Singer was tall and handsome, with a gift for charming people and a complete lack of moral conscience. He was born in 1811 in upstate New York, the same year as Edward Clark. He ran away from home at age 12 with almost no education. His great dream was to become a famous actor. For nearly 20 years, Singer wandered across America with traveling theater companies. He performed in small towns and rough cities. He took whatever roles he could get. The work rarely paid well, but Singer discovered he had other talents beyond acting. He was good with machines. He could look at any mechanical device and understand how it worked. He could imagine improvements and build them with his own hands. In 1850, Singer was working in a machine shop in Boston when his employer asked him to repair a sewing machine. Singer examined the device and realized he could build something much better. He worked obsessively for 11 days, barely sleeping, focused entirely on his design. At the end of that time, he had created a prototype that would change the world. Singer's sewing machine could sew continuously on any part of a garment. It could handle curved seams, not just straight lines. A skilled operator could produce 900 stitches per minute, nothing like it had ever existed before. Singer secured a patent in August 1851. A new industry was born, but Singer was not a businessman. He was an actor who happened to invent things. He had no idea how to sell his machine or build a company. He needed a partner who understood money and organization. He needed Edward Clark. The two men formed I.M. Singer and Company in 1851. Their partnership was difficult from the start. They argued constantly. They disagreed about nearly everything. Singer wanted to spend money. Clark wanted to save it. Singer chased women. Clark went home to his wife. Singer created drama. Clark created order, but they needed each other. Singer had invented the machine. Clark would turn that invention into a fortune, and Clark proved to be one of the most brilliant marketers of his generation. It was Clark who invented the installment payment plan. Sewing machines cost over $100 at a time when average families earned perhaps $500 per year. Nobody could afford to pay that much money all at once. Clark's solution was revolutionary. He allowed customers to pay a small amount each month until the machine was paid off. Suddenly, middle-class housewives could own Singer sewing machines. Sales exploded across the country. While Clark built the business, Singer built families. He seemed unable to remain faithful to anyone. His legal wife, Catherine Maria Haley, bore him 2 children before he abandoned her in the 1830s. He then established a household with Mary Ann Sponsler, who believed herself to be his wife. She gave him 10 children over many years. At the same time, Singer was involved with Mary McGonigal, who bore him 5 more children under the assumed family name Matthews. There were other women as well, other relationships scattered across Manhattan. Singer moved between these households with astonishing boldness. He kept them ignorant of each other for years through a combination of lies and careful scheduling. The arrangement collapsed in 1860. Mary Ann Sponsler was walking on Fifth Avenue when she spotted Singer driving past in an open carriage. Seated beside him was Mary McGonigal. The confrontation that followed became the scandal of the season. When investigators began looking into Singer's domestic arrangements, they discovered the full scope of his deception. 4 separate families in Manhattan alone, at least 16 children, multiple women who believed they were his wife. It was shocking even by the loose standards of the time. Accused of bigamy and adultery, facing possible criminal charges, Singer fled to England. There he met Isabella Eugenie Boyer, a French woman of 19 years who was strikingly beautiful. Singer married her in 1863. She gave him 6 more children. Some historians believe she later served as the model for the Statue of Liberty, though this remains disputed. Singer never returned to live in America. He built an enormous estate in England that locals called the Wigwam. It was reportedly one of the largest private homes in the country. He died there in July 1875 at age 64, leaving behind a fortune of approximately $13 million. In today's money, that would equal over $300 million. His will divided the money among 20 of his surviving children, though not equally. Some received generous sums, others got almost nothing. One son who had supported his mother during her divorce received only $500. Even in death, Singer played favorites among the families he had created and abandoned. Edward Clark emerged from this chaos with effective control of the Singer Manufacturing Company. He had spent 2 decades managing the business while Singer lived flamboyantly and irresponsibly. Now the fortune was his to direct. Clark was 64 years old, wealthy beyond measure and ready for something new. He turned his attention to real estate. He began studying apartment buildings in New York and Europe. He started developing his ideas about how luxury apartments should work, and he began planning the building that would make him famous for something other than sewing machines. The money that would build the Dakota came from scandal and from broken families. It came from a man who could not control himself and from a man who controlled everything. It came from the meeting of chaos and order, of brilliant invention and brilliant management, and it would reshape how Americans thought about where they should live. The stage was set, the fortune was ready, the men who would change everything were preparing to begin. Edward Clark had his vision of apartment palaces on the edge of the wilderness. Henry Hardenberg had his European training and his gift for design. The money from sewing machines was available to spend. Now all they needed was the courage to move forward despite the mockery. They needed the determination to build something that had never existed before. They needed the confidence that they were right and everyone else was wrong. In October 1880, construction began on a massive stone building at the corner of 72nd Street and 8th Avenue. Workers dug foundations deep into the Manhattan rock. Masons began laying walls that would be 3 to 4 feet thick at their base. A fortress was rising in the wilderness. Critics continued to laugh, they continued to predict failure, they continued to call it Clark's folly, but Edward Clark ignored them all. He had bet his reputation on an idea, now he would see it through to the end. What happened next would determine whether wealthy Americans would ever accept apartment living. The building rising from the empty lots would either prove Clark right or destroy his name forever. Everything depended on what came next. Before Edward Clark could build his grand apartment palace in the wilderness, someone else had to go first. Someone had to prove that respectable Americans would even consider living in apartments. Someone had to show that the idea was not completely insane. That someone was a man named Rutherford Stuyvesant. He was a member of one of New York's oldest families, a family whose name appeared on street signs and property deeds across Manhattan. In 1869, Stuyvesant hired architect Richard Morris Hunt to design something New York had never seen before. It would be an apartment building, but not for poor people. It would target middle-class families of good reputation and solid income. The building rose on East 18th Street near Irving Place. It was called the Stuyvesant, named after the family that built it. It stood 5 stories tall, made of red brick with white stone trim. It had a mansard roof in the French style that was fashionable at the time. Inside, the Stuyvesant offered 40 apartments. Each apartment had its own kitchen and bathroom, features that many private homes still lacked. The building had steam heat throughout, warming every room without the need for individual fireplaces or stoves. It had gas lighting in all the common areas. Most remarkably, it had an elevator that could carry residents to the upper floors. The apartments were modest by later standards. They were designed for families of moderate means, not the truly wealthy, but they were comfortable and well built. They had high ceilings and large windows. They had proper ventilation and modern plumbing. They offered everything a respectable family needed to live with dignity. The public reaction was mixed. Some people praised the building as modern and progressive. They admired its French style and its conveniences. They predicted that apartment living would become common in crowded cities. Others remained skeptical. They wondered whether decent families would really want to live so close to strangers. They worried about privacy and noise and loss of independence, but the Stuyvesant succeeded. Respectable merchants and professional men rented apartments there. Lawyers and doctors moved their families in. Small business owners signed leases. These were not wealthy people, but they were respectable people. They discovered that apartment living was actually quite pleasant. The tenants appreciated not having to maintain a house. They enjoyed having a professional staff handle heating and repairs. They liked living near other families of similar background and education. They found that sharing a building did not mean losing their privacy or their respectability. The success of the Stuyvesant inspired imitators across Manhattan. Other developers began building apartment houses for middle-class families. By the mid-1870s, dozens of such buildings existed. Names like the Hawthorne and the Berkeley and the Grosvenor appeared on the streets. Each building tried to attract respectable tenants by offering good construction and modern conveniences. These buildings proved several important things. They proved that Americans would accept apartment living if the quality was high enough. They proved that sharing a building did not destroy social standing. They proved that proper design could provide privacy even in a shared structure. Most importantly, they proved that apartment buildings could make money for their investors. But all of these buildings targeted people of moderate income. None of them dared to aim for the truly wealthy. The very rich still lived in private mansions. they still employed armies of servants. They still maintained their own stables and furnaces and private domains. Nobody had yet convinced them that apartment living could match what they already had. Edward Clark studied these middle-class apartment buildings carefully. He visited the Stuyvesant several times. He examined how the apartments were laid out. He noted which features tenants appreciated and which problems they complained about. He learned that the building's entrance courtyard sometimes filled with delivery wagons and service carts, creating congestion that annoyed residents. Clark also studied apartment buildings in Europe during his business travels. He visited grand structures in Paris where wealthy families occupied entire floors. He saw how European architects designed buildings around central courtyards that provided light and air. He learned about systems that separated service functions from residential spaces. He absorbed lessons that American builders had not yet learned. In 1879, Clark decided to test his ideas. He hired a young architect named Henry Janeway Hardenberg to design an apartment building on 7th Avenue near 55th Street. The building would be called the Van Corlear. It would not target the very wealthy, but it would be nicer than buildings like the Stuyvesant. It would serve as a test run for the grander project Clark already had in mind. The Van Corlear cost about $8,000 per apartment to construct. That was more than double what most developers spent on middle-class apartments. Clark used better materials and hired better craftsmen. He insisted on proper soundproofing between apartments. He made sure every room had adequate light and ventilation. The building succeeded. Solid middle-class families rented apartments there. They stayed for years. They paid their rent on time. They maintained their apartments well. They proved that people would pay more for better quality. The Van Corlear gave Clark confidence that his larger vision could work. Now Clark was ready for something far more ambitious. He would build luxury apartments that could rival the finest private homes. He would create a building so grand that even wealthy families would choose to live there. He would prove that apartments could work for any class of people if they were designed well enough. But the skeptics were everywhere and they were loud. New York society dismissed Clark's plans as fantasy. The wealthy families who controlled the city's social life could not imagine living in apartments. They had strong opinions about the idea, and those opinions were almost entirely negative. Living in an apartment meant sharing walls with strangers. It meant hearing your neighbors through the ceiling and floor. It meant encountering other families in hallways and lobbies. It meant giving up control over who lived next door. To people accustomed to complete privacy, these things seemed intolerable. Apartment living also meant riding elevators with your neighbors. It meant potentially meeting them on your way in or out. It meant coordinating your comings and goings with other families. The wealthy valued their independence. They did not want to adjust their schedules to accommodate others. There were concerns about social standing as well. In New York society, your address mattered enormously. Living on Fifth Avenue in a private mansion announced your wealth and importance. Living in an apartment, no matter how nice, suggested something less. It suggested that you could not afford your own home. It suggested that you had somehow failed to achieve what successful people were supposed to achieve. Even the practical arguments against apartments were powerful. In a private home, you controlled everything. You hired your own servants and trained them to your standards. You decorated according to your own taste. You made all decisions about maintenance and repairs. You answered to nobody but yourself. In an apartment, many of these choices would be shared. You would have to accept building staff chosen by management. You would have to follow building rules you did not make. You would have to compromise with other residents about shared spaces and services. To wealthy people accustomed to complete autonomy, this seemed like an unacceptable loss of freedom. The critics had more concerns. What would happen to property values in neighborhoods where apartment buildings appeared? Would the presence of multiple families in one structure lower the tone of the entire area? Would private homes nearby lose their value? Property owners worried that apartments would damage their investments. There were worries about noise and congestion as well. A large apartment building might house dozens of families. All of those families would have servants. All of them would receive deliveries. All of them would come and go at various times. The traffic of people and vehicles could overwhelm a quiet residential street. Some critics simply could not imagine how such buildings would work. How would you separate the wealthy families from their servants? How would you prevent awkward encounters in hallways and staircases? How would you maintain the clear social boundaries that existed in private homes? These practical questions had no obvious answers. The newspapers reflected and amplified these doubts. When word spread that Edward Clark planned to build luxury apartments on the Upper West Side, reporters treated it as a joke. They wrote mocking articles about his folly. They predicted that the building would stand empty. They suggested that Clark had more money than sense. Real estate experts were equally dismissive. They pointed out that the Upper West Side was undeveloped for good reasons. Nobody wanted to live there. The location was too far from everything that mattered. Even if wealthy families would consider apartment living, they would never choose such a remote location. Some critics suggested that Clark was simply trying to make quick money from a questionable scheme. They accused him of planning to build cheaply and rent at high prices to unsuspecting families. They warned potential tenants to be cautious about any promises Clark made. The opposition was nearly universal. Almost nobody believed that luxury apartments could succeed. Almost nobody thought wealthy families would abandon their mansions. Almost nobody expected Clark's building to find tenants. The consensus was clear: the project would fail. But Edward Clark had heard all of these objections before in a different context. When he first proposed the installment payment plan for sewing machines, critics said it would never work. They said customers would not make their payments. They said the company would lose money on defaults. They said the entire scheme was foolish. Clark had proven them wrong about that. Sales had exploded when people could pay monthly. The default rate was tiny. The installment plan had made the Singer Manufacturing Company enormously profitable. Clark had learned not to trust conventional wisdom. He had learned that people would embrace new ideas if those ideas genuinely served their interests. The same would be true with apartments, Clark believed. Wealthy families might claim they would never live in apartments, but if apartments offered genuine advantages over mansion living, some families would make the switch, and once a few families did it successfully, others would follow. All Clark needed to do was build something good enough to convince the first brave adopters. The location Edward Clark chose made the skeptics even more certain he would fail. In 1880, the corner of 72nd Street and 8th Avenue was not just unfashionable, it was barely part of the city at all. The Upper West Side had been farmland for most of the 19th century. As late as 1870, much of the land west of Central Park remained undeveloped. Rocky hills rose from the Manhattan bedrock. Small streams ran down toward the Hudson River. Patches of forest still grew in some areas. By 1880, some development had begun. A few scattered buildings dotted the landscape. Some were modest homes for working families. Others were shanties and temporary structures. There were small shops and taverns serving local residents, but there was nothing that wealthy families would recognize as a proper neighborhood. The land itself presented challenges. The terrain was uneven and rocky. Building required blasting through bedrock in some places. Water drainage was poor. The soil quality varied greatly from block to block. Developers faced higher construction costs on the west side than in flatter, better-drained areas. Transportation was the biggest problem. Getting from the Upper West Side to the business districts downtown was difficult and time-consuming. You could walk, but the distance was several miles. You could take a horse-drawn omnibus, but the ride was slow and uncomfortable. The buses stopped frequently to pick up passengers. They got stuck in traffic. A trip that should take 30 minutes often took an hour or more. The lack of amenities made the area even less appealing. There were no fine shops where ladies could buy clothing and household goods. There were no proper churches for respectable families. There were no social clubs or concert halls. There were few gas streetlights, making the streets dark and potentially dangerous at night. The sidewalks were unpaved dirt that turned to mud when it rained. Compare this to the Upper East Side, which had developed rapidly after Central Park opened. East of the park, elegant brownstone houses lined streets with proper sidewalks and gas lighting. The neighborhood had churches and shops and all the amenities wealthy families expected. Other wealthy families lived there, providing social connections and suitable neighbors. Everything about the Upper East Side suggested prosperity and progress. The Upper West Side suggested nothing of the kind. It looked and felt like frontier territory. Respectable families had no reason to move there. They would be isolated from their friends and their social world. They would lack convenient access to shops and services. They would be living on the edge of civilization for no good reason. This was where Edward Clark chose to spend $2 million. This was where he planned to build the finest apartment house in America. The location alone seemed proof that the project was doomed, but Clark saw advantages that others missed. The land was cheap precisely because nobody else wanted it. He could afford to buy a large plot, much larger than he could have purchased in a fashionable neighborhood. That meant he could build a bigger structure with more generous spaces around it. The site he selected had specific virtues. It sat on a slight rise, giving it better drainage than surrounding areas. The elevation would also provide views in multiple directions once the building rose high enough. The plot was large enough to include gardens and recreational space for residents. Most importantly, 72nd Street was one of the widest crosstown roads in Manhattan. It measured 100 feet from side to side, much wider than typical streets. This meant the building would not feel cramped even when neighboring structures eventually appeared. It meant there would always be light and air reaching the lower floors. Clark also understood that transportation was about to improve dramatically. The 9th Avenue Elevated Railway had recently extended its tracks to the Upper West Side. This new train line changed everything. It ran on steel tracks raised high above the street on iron pillars. The trains could travel much faster than horse-drawn vehicles because they did not have to deal with street traffic. From 72nd Street, a resident could walk to the elevated railway station in just a few minutes. The train would carry them downtown to the business districts in less than half an hour. This was faster and more reliable than any other transportation option in the city. The elevated railway made living uptown practical in a way it had never been before. Clark believed that rapid transit would drive development. As transportation improved, people would be willing to live farther from downtown. They would trade proximity for space and lower costs. The Upper West Side would not remain empty forever. Someone would develop it eventually. Clark intended to be first. There was another advantage to being first. The building that established a neighborhood could set its character. If Clark built something grand and attracted wealthy residents, other developers would follow his lead. The entire area might become fashionable. His building would be the anchor that drew others. It would define what the Upper West Side could become. Clark also had a theory about wealthy families and change. The very wealthiest would never move to a new neighborhood. They were too invested in their current homes and their established social networks. But families of slightly less wealth, professionals and successful merchants might be willing to take a chance. These families had money but not unlimited money. They might appreciate cheaper land and lower costs. They might see opportunity where the truly rich saw only inconvenience. If Clark could attract this group, he would have his market. There were many such families in New York, far more than there were spots in fashionable neighborhoods. They had the money to rent luxury apartments. They just needed a reason to choose an unfashionable location. Clark would give them that reason by building something extraordinary. The gamble was enormous. $2 million was a vast fortune even for a man as wealthy as Edward Clark. If the building failed to attract tenants, the loss would be catastrophic. His reputation would be destroyed. His family might even lose a significant portion of their wealth. But Clark believed the risk was worth taking. He had studied the problem carefully. He had tested his ideas with the Van Corlear. He had learned from European examples. He had thought through every objection and found answers. Now it was time to move forward despite the doubters. In October 1880, workers began preparing the site. They cleared the land of debris and vegetation. They marked out where the foundation walls would go. They began the hard work of building something that had never existed before. For his architect, Edward Clark chose the man who had designed the Van Corlear. Henry Janeway Hardenberg was only 33 years old, but he had already proven himself talented and reliable. More importantly, he had the right kind of training for what Clark wanted to build. Hardenberg was born in 1847 in New Brunswick, New Jersey. His family was of Dutch descent, one of many such families in the New York area. Rather than attending a formal architecture school, Hardenberg had learned his profession the traditional way. He had apprenticed under an established architect. His teacher was Detlef Lenau, a German-born architect who had trained at the prestigious academy in Paris. Lenau brought European design traditions to America. He taught his students to study classical architecture and to understand the principles of good proportion and ornament. He emphasized quality construction and careful attention to detail. This European-influenced training was exactly what Clark needed. American architects of the 1880s tended to follow English models. They designed buildings that looked like they belonged in London. But Clark wanted something different. He wanted his building to feel substantial and permanent. He wanted it to combine the best European traditions with American scale and ambition. Hardenberg understood what Clark was asking for. He had studied European architecture through books and through his teacher's instruction. He knew how French and German architects designed large urban buildings. He could draw on multiple traditions to create something original. The challenge Clark gave him was enormous. The building needed to convince wealthy families that apartment living could match or exceed mansion living. That meant every aspect of the design had to be carefully considered. The exterior had to look impressive and substantial. It could not look like a typical apartment building for the middle class. It needed to announce its importance from a distance. It needed to make a statement about quality and permanence. The interior layout was even more critical. The apartments had to feel like private homes, not like hotel rooms or boarding house spaces. They needed to be large enough for wealthy families and their servants. They needed to provide privacy even though other families lived on the other side of the walls. The building also needed to solve practical problems that had plagued earlier apartment buildings. There had to be adequate light and ventilation for every apartment. There had to be a way to separate resident traffic from servant traffic. There had to be systems for heating, plumbing, and garbage removal that worked reliably. Every detail mattered. Hardenberg spent months on the design. He studied the site carefully. He sketched different arrangements of rooms and corridors. He calculated how to fit 65 apartments into the available space while giving each apartment adequate size and light. He thought about how residents would move through the building and how servants would do their work without interfering with the residents. The design that emerged was unlike anything New York had seen. Hardenberg drew inspiration from multiple European traditions without copying any of them directly. The style was perhaps closest to German Renaissance architecture with its high gables and robust ornamentation. But there were French influences as well and touches that were purely American. The building would be roughly square in its footprint, but rather than being a solid block, it would be shaped like an H when viewed from above. A central courtyard would occupy the middle space. This arrangement meant that every apartment could have windows on two sides. Every room would get natural light and fresh air. The courtyard served multiple purposes. It provided light and ventilation, which was crucial before air conditioning existed. It created a private outdoor space for residents, separated from the public streets. Most ingeniously, it allowed carriages to enter through an archway and deposit residents inside the building, protected from weather and shielded from public view. Hardenberg designed the courtyard with two levels. The upper level at street height would be reserved for residents. Below it, accessible by ramps from the side streets, a lower level would handle all service functions. Delivery wagons could enter the lower courtyard, drop off their goods, and leave without ever appearing in the residential areas. This solved the problem that had plagued the Stuyvesant and other early apartment buildings. The circulation system was brilliantly thought out. 4 main staircases would serve residents, one in each corner of the courtyard. 4 passenger elevators would be positioned at these corners as well, but servants would use completely separate routes. 4 service staircases and 4 service elevators would be positioned at the midpoints of each side. It would connect directly to the kitchens and back rooms of apartments. A resident might never see a servant carrying supplies through the building. This separation was crucial for wealthy families. In their private homes, servants used back stairs and back doors. They moved through different spaces than the family used. They appeared only when summoned. Hardenberg's design allowed apartment residents to maintain these same social boundaries even though many families shared one building. The building would rise 8 stories above street level with an additional floor tucked beneath the steep roof. At a time when most residential buildings stood 4 or 5 stories tall, this height was impressive. The structure would dominate its neighborhood. It would be visible from great distances. Hardenberg paid careful attention to the facade. Every surface would be decorated but not overwhelming. He used buff-colored brick for most of the exterior. Sandstone trim would accent the windows and doorways. Terracotta panels would add decorative touches. The roof would be slate in a deep charcoal color. The roofline was particularly important. Hardenberg designed a complex arrangement of gables, dormers, and chimneys. The silhouette would be irregular and interesting. The building would not look like a simple box. It would have the kind of varied roofline that characterized European town halls and guild houses. All of this decoration served a purpose beyond beauty. It signaled quality and permanence. It announced that this was not a cheap commercial building thrown up quickly for profit. It was a structure built to last for generations, built with care and attention to every detail. The construction budget reflected this ambition. Individual apartments would cost about $25,000 each to build. That was an enormous sum, more than many people would earn in their entire working lives, but Clark insisted that quality was essential. If this building failed to impress, the entire concept of luxury apartments would be discredited. Hardenberg threw himself into the project. He oversaw every aspect of the construction. He specified exactly which materials should be used. He designed custom details for the lobby and entrances. He thought about how residents would experience the building from the moment they approached it. But as the design work progressed through 1880 and construction began that fall, Edward Clark was approaching 70 years of age. He had risked his fortune and his reputation on this project. He desperately wanted to see it completed. He wanted to watch wealthy families move in. He wanted to hear the skeptics admit they had been wrong. He would not get that chance. The building rising from the Manhattan Rock would become his memorial instead of his triumph. But the vision he brought to life would change American cities forever, even though he would never know it. The Dakota was different from anything New York had ever seen. When construction began in October 1880, the building site was surrounded by empty lots and rough ground. Workers arrived each morning to find a landscape that looked more like countryside than city. But over the next 4 years, that landscape would be transformed. Construction began with the foundations. Workers dug deep into the Manhattan bedrock. The foundation walls would be 3 to 4 feet thick at their base. This was far more substantial than most buildings required. But Edward Clark wanted the Dakota to stand for centuries. He wanted foundations that could support the enormous weight of stone and brick that would rise above them. The building used traditional construction methods rather than the newer steel frame techniques that were just being developed. The walls would be load-bearing masonry. They would support their own weight plus the weight of the floors and roof. Iron beams would span between walls to hold up the floors. Concrete would be poured over the beams to create flat surfaces. Between the layers of flooring, workers reportedly packed mud that had been dug from Central Park. This unusual technique served two purposes. The mud provided additional fireproofing. Fire was a constant danger in 19th-century cities. Buildings burned regularly. Any method that slowed the spread of flames was valuable. The mud also provided soundproofing between floors. Residents in one apartment would be less likely to hear noise from apartments above or below them. The exterior walls rose slowly through 1881 and 1882. Masons laid buff-colored brick row after row, floor after floor. The brick came from kilns outside the city. Each brick was inspected before being set in place. Workers mixed mortar by hand and spread it carefully. The walls had to be perfectly plumb and level. Sandstone blocks were set at intervals to provide trim and decoration. These blocks came from quarries in several states. Each block was cut to exact specifications before being shipped to the site. Stone carvers shaped decorative elements by hand. Terracotta panels were manufactured specifically for the Dakota. Each panel was unique, made by skilled craftsmen following Hardenberg's designs. The roof structure was particularly complex. Hardenberg had designed multiple gables and dormers. Each one required careful carpentry and precise measurements. The roof framing was heavy timber, massive beams that would support the weight of slate tiles. The slate came from quarries in Pennsylvania. Workers carried the heavy tiles up scaffolding and nailed them in overlapping rows. Chimneys rose at intervals across the roof. The Dakota would have dozens of fireplaces. Each fireplace needed its own flue to carry smoke safely outside. The chimneys were built of brick and rose high above the roofline. They became part of the building's distinctive silhouette. The courtyard took shape as the walls rose. Workers created the two-level system that Hardenberg had designed. The upper level would be at street height. The lower level was excavated below that. Ramps would connect the lower courtyard to 72nd and 73rd Streets. Drainage systems had to be installed to prevent water from pooling in the lower area. As construction progressed, challenges emerged. In August 1883, plasterers went on strike. They were protesting the employment of workers who did not belong to their union. Other craftsmen briefly joined the strike in solidarity. Work stopped for several weeks. But eventually, the strike was settled and construction resumed. The remote location created difficulties. Transporting materials to the site took longer than it would have in a more developed neighborhood. There were no nearby sources for supplies. Everything had to be brought in by wagon over rough roads. This added to the cost and slowed the pace of work. Weather caused delays as well. Winter cold made some types of work impossible. Mortar would not set properly in freezing temperatures. Snow and ice made the construction site dangerous. Workers had to be careful not to fall from scaffolding. Spring rains turned the unpaved streets into mud. Wagons got stuck. Deliveries were delayed. But the most significant challenge came in autumn 1882. Edward Clark fell ill at his country estate in Cooperstown, New York. He was 70 years old and had been in declining health for some time. The illness was serious. By October, it was clear he would not recover. On October 14, 1882, Edward Clark died. The cause was listed as malarial fever. The man who had conceived the Dakota and financed its construction would never see it completed. The walls had reached their full height. The roof structure was being assembled, but the interior was still raw space. None of the apartments had been finished. None of the services had been installed. The building was perhaps 2 years from being ready for residents. Clark's obituaries focused mainly on his role in the Singer Manufacturing Company. They praised his business genius and his innovations in marketing. The strange apartment house rising on the Upper West Side received brief mention as an eccentricity. Few people understood yet what Clark had been trying to achieve. Clark's estate was valued at approximately $25 million. Some estimates ran as high as $50 million. This staggering sum reflected his share of the Singer fortune and decades of careful investments. His will distributed portions of this wealth to various family members, but the bulk of his real estate holdings, including the unfinished Dakota, passed to his grandson. Edward Severin Clark was only 12 years old. He could not manage property or make business decisions. The estate went into the hands of trustees who would guide it until the boy reached adulthood. These trustees faced an immediate question. What should they do about the Dakota? The building was far from finished. It would require at least another $1 million to complete. There was no guarantee it would find tenants once finished. The skeptics had predicted failure. Perhaps the trustees should cut their losses, sell the unfinished structure, and move on. But the trustees decided to honor Edward Clark's vision. They had presumably been selected by Clark himself. They understood what he was trying to accomplish. They committed to finishing the Dakota exactly as he had planned. Whatever changes or economies might have tempted other managers, Clark's trustees maintained his standards. Construction continued through the winter of 1882 and into 1883. Henry Hardenberg remained as architect. He supervised the interior finishing work that would transform raw space into livable apartments. Craftsmen installed the systems that would make the building function. Slowly, the Dakota came to life. The architecture of the Dakota defies simple description. Historians have debated its style for more than a century. Some call it German Renaissance revival. They point to the high gables and robust decoration that recall town halls in Northern Europe. Others see French influences and suggest the design evokes chateau architecture. One critic simply called it eclectic Victorian and left classification to others. Perhaps the confusion is appropriate. Hardenberg drew from multiple traditions without copying any single source. He combined elements in ways that felt fresh and original. The result was a building that looked European but was distinctly American in scale and ambition. The structure rises 8 stories above street level. An additional floor sits beneath the steep roof slopes. At the time of completion in 1884, this made the Dakota one of the taller residential buildings in Manhattan. Most apartment houses stood only 4 or 5 stories. Private mansions rarely exceeded 3 or 4 floors. The Dakota's height announced its importance. The exterior is composed primarily of buff-colored brick. This warm yellow-brown tone gives the building a softer appearance than red brick would provide. Sandstone trim accents the windows and major features. The stone is lighter in color than the brick, creating contrast. Terracotta panels add decorative touches throughout. These panels feature faces, flowers, geometric patterns, and other ornamental elements. The roofline is the Dakota's most distinctive feature. Multiple gables project from the main roof at different points. Dormers of various sizes break up the slate surface. Chimneys rise at regular intervals. The overall effect is complex and irregular. The building does not present a simple rectangular profile. Instead, it has the varied silhouette of a medieval European structure. When viewed from street level, the Dakota presents different faces on different sides. The main entrance on 72nd Street is the most elaborate. A grand archway dominates this facade. The archway is called a porte-cochere, a French term for a covered entrance where carriages can pass. This archway measures approximately 16 feet wide and 20 feet tall. A horse-drawn carriage could easily drive through it into the courtyard. Above the archway, decorative elements proliferate. Terracotta panels frame the opening. Stone carvings add detail. According to some accounts, portraits of a man and woman appear above the doorway. These may represent Isaac Singer and his wife Isabella, though this identification is uncertain. A figure that resembles a Native American looks out from the roofline. This may be a reference to the building's name and its associations with the Dakota Territory. The courtyard is the heart of Hardenberg's design. From above, the building's footprint forms a rough H shape. The courtyard occupies the space in the middle of the H. This arrangement means that apartments on all 4 wings of the building can have windows facing the courtyard. Every apartment gets natural light from at least 2 directions. The courtyard serves multiple functions beyond providing light. It creates a private outdoor space for residents. The high walls on 4 sides block wind and muffle street noise. A fountain would eventually be placed in the center. Trees and plantings would soften the paved surfaces. Residents could step outside without leaving the building's protection. The 2-level courtyard system was Hardenberg's solution to a practical problem. Residents needed access to the building, but so did servants and delivery people. Mixing these 2 groups in the same space had created problems in earlier apartment buildings. The Dakota separated them completely. The upper courtyard at street level belongs to residents. Carriages bringing family members home enter through the grand archway. They stop in the courtyard to let passengers step out. Then they exit through the same archway or continue to the building's private stables. Residents see an elegant space with good paving and proper drainage. The lower courtyard handles all service functions. Ramps descend from both 72nd and 73rd Streets. Delivery wagons drive down these ramps to the lower level. There they unload supplies and then drive back up to the street. Residents in their apartments above never see these wagons. The noise and activity of deliveries remain hidden from view. 4 main staircases provide resident access to the upper floors. These staircases occupy the 4 corners where the wings meet. They are wide and well lit. The stairs themselves are stone or hardwood. The railings are substantial. Everything suggests quality and permanence. 4 passenger elevators serve the building as well. These hydraulic elevators were still relatively new technology in the 1880s. They used water pressure to raise and lower the cars. An operator controlled each elevator. Passengers would enter the car, state their floor, and be carried upward smoothly. For people accustomed to climbing stairs, elevators seemed almost magical. The separation of residents and servants continues inside. 4 service staircases run up the building at the midpoints of each side. These stairs connect directly to service areas of the apartments. 4 service elevators are positioned at these same points. Servants and delivery people use these separate routes. They rarely encounter residents. This separation was crucial to the Dakota's success. Wealthy families expected clear boundaries between their world and the world of their servants. In a private mansion, these boundaries were maintained through separate entrances, back stairs, and service corridors. The Dakota provided the same separation even though dozens of families shared the building. The exterior ornamentation rewards close observation. Terracotta panels depict various subjects. Some show human faces, others feature flowers or fruit, still others display geometric patterns. No two panels are identical. Each was crafted individually according to Hardenberg's designs. Stone carvings add detail around windows and doors. Brackets support balconies on upper floors. Decorative ironwork appears on railings and window guards. Every surface receives attention. Nothing is left plain or unfinished. The building's corners are slightly different from its straight sides. The corners have projecting elements that create shadows and depth. This breaks up what might otherwise be flat wall surfaces. The play of light and shadow changes throughout the day as the sun moves. The building looks slightly different at different times. Materials were chosen for durability as well as appearance. The buff-colored brick resists weathering better than some other types. The sandstone trim is dense and hard. The slate roof will last for generations with proper maintenance. Hardenberg and Clark intended the Dakota to stand for centuries. They built accordingly. Inside the Dakota, the luxury became even more apparent. Craftsmen spent months on details that most visitors would never consciously notice. But these details created an atmosphere of quality that pervaded the entire building. The main lobby set the tone. When residents entered through the porte cochere, they found themselves in a space that felt more like a private club than an apartment house. The floors were marble in subtle patterns. The walls featured wood paneling. The ceiling was decorated plasterwork. Lighting fixtures were bronze and glass. Doorways leading from the lobby to the staircases and elevators had substantial frames. The doors themselves were heavy wood with brass hardware. Everything felt solid and permanent. Nothing suggested that this was temporary housing or cheap construction. The elevator operators wore uniforms. They greeted residents by name. They operated the elevator smoothly, stopping precisely at each floor. The elevator cars themselves were paneled in wood. They had brass fixtures and mirrors. Riding in them felt like being in a private conveyance rather than a mechanical device. The corridors on each floor were wide and well lit. Windows at the ends provided natural light during the day. Gas fixtures would illuminate them at night. The walls were plastered smooth and painted in neutral colors. The floors were hardwood. Doors to individual apartments were substantial and well fitted. No drafts would seep through gaps. The apartments themselves ranged dramatically in size. The smallest had perhaps 4 rooms, the largest had 20 or more. Clark had deliberately created this variety. He understood that different families had different needs. Some wanted compact spaces, others required room for large families and many servants. No two apartments were identical. Hardenberg had designed each one individually. The layouts varied according to their position in the building. Corner apartments had windows on 2 exterior walls. Interior apartments faced the courtyard on one side and a street on the other. Penthouses on the top floor had access to roof terraces. Clark encouraged buyers to modify their apartments. Walls could be moved if they were not load-bearing. Rooms could be combined to create larger spaces. Adjacent apartments could be connected if a family needed more room. The building was designed to be flexible. Each family could create the home they wanted. A typical large apartment might include an entrance gallery, a formal living room, a dining room, a library, 4 or 5 bedrooms, multiple bathrooms, a kitchen, a butler's pantry, and servants' quarters. Total floor space might exceed 3,000 square feet. This was comparable to a substantial townhouse. The entrance gallery served an important function. Visitors entered here and could be received without penetrating deeper into the apartment. The family could maintain privacy while still entertaining guests. The gallery often had a place for coats and hats. It might have a mirror and a small table for calling cards. The living room was the primary space for entertaining. It faced the street for the best light and views. Windows were tall, often extending from near the floor to above head height. The ceiling might be 10 or 11 feet high, creating a sense of spaciousness. A fireplace provided a focal point. Moldings and decorative plasterwork added elegance. Dining rooms were substantial. They needed to accommodate large tables and many chairs. Wealthy families often entertained dinner guests. The dining room had to impress. Built-in cabinets might hold china and silver. A sideboard provided space for serving dishes. Access to the butler's pantry allowed servants to bring food from the kitchen without disrupting the meal. Libraries or studies gave men a private space. These rooms might have built-in bookshelves. They would certainly have a desk and comfortable chairs. The atmosphere was meant to be quiet and contemplative. This was where a man might read, write letters, or conduct business from home. Bedrooms varied in size. The master bedroom would be large and well-appointed. Children's rooms might be smaller. Guest rooms accommodated visitors. Each bedroom ideally had good light and cross-ventilation. Closets were built in rather than being separate pieces of furniture. Bathrooms were still relatively uncommon in private homes in the 1880s. Many houses had only one bathroom shared by the entire family. The Dakota provided multiple bathrooms in larger apartments. They had porcelain fixtures, tile floors, and running water both hot and cold. This was modern luxury. Kitchens were equipped for serious cooking. They had large stoves, ample counter space, and storage for supplies. A pantry connected the kitchen to the dining room. Servants could stage food here before serving it. The butler's pantry often had a sink for washing dishes and glassware. Servants' quarters were separate from family spaces. Maids and cooks had their own small bedrooms. These rooms were plain but adequate. They had windows for light and air. Servants had their own bathroom facilities separate from those used by the family. The finishing materials throughout were of the highest quality. Floors were oak, mahogany, or other hardwoods. Some floors had inlaid patterns using different colored woods. Ceilings featured hand-carved wood panels or decorative plasterwork. Fireplace mantels were carved marble, and reportedly no two were alike in the entire building. Door frames and window frames received the same attention to detail. Moldings were carved rather than plain. Hardware was solid brass rather than plated metal. Nothing in the apartments suggested economy or shortcuts. One persistent legend concerns Edward Clark's personal apartment. According to stories that have circulated for decades, Clark specified floors inlaid with sterling silver. This extraordinary detail would have been an ultimate display of wealth. Whether this was ever actually installed remains uncertain. Clark died before moving in and his apartment passed to others. But the story persists as a testament to the extravagance that characterized the entire project. The quality of craftsmanship was exceptional by any standard. Carpenters who worked on the Dakota were masters of their trade. Plasterers created smooth surfaces and elaborate decorative elements. Painters applied multiple coats with care. Every trade worked to the highest standards of the time. This level of quality came at enormous cost. Individual apartments cost approximately $25,000 each to construct. This was more than 3 times what Clark had spent per unit at the Van Corlear. But Clark believed that luxury apartments had to actually be luxurious. Wealthy families would not accept anything less than the best. But the apartments themselves were only part of what the Dakota offered. The services and amenities were what truly set it apart from mansion living. Clark understood that convenience and freedom from responsibility were as important as physical luxury. On the ground floor, Clark created a dining establishment that rivaled the finest restaurants in New York. The main dining room was finished in the style of an English baronial hall. Marble floors reflected light from elaborate fixtures. Walls were paneled in carved English oak. Bronze decorative work adorned the upper walls. The ceiling was quartered oak with intricate carving. A massive fireplace built from Scottish brownstone dominated the center of the room. It was large enough that several people could have stood inside it. The fireplace added atmosphere and warmth. It made the dining room feel like a great hall in a country estate. Adjacent to the main dining room were additional spaces. A ladies' dining room provided a place where women could eat without men present. Private rooms could be reserved for dinner parties. The Dakota's dining facilities offered options for different occasions and different social situations. Residents who preferred to eat in their own apartments could do so with remarkable ease. A system of dumbwaiters connected the dining facilities to kitchens throughout the building. Meals prepared by the restaurant's professional staff could be sent up to individual apartments. The food would arrive hot and ready to serve. This arrangement offered the best of both worlds. A family could enjoy restaurant-quality meals in their own dining room. They could maintain their privacy while benefiting from professional cooking. Their own servants would receive the food from the dumbwaiter and present it properly. The family never had to leave home. The staff required to maintain this operation was enormous. Clark planned for approximately 150 employees to work within the building. Elevator operators and doormen were merely the most visible. Behind the scenes labored a small army of workers. A resident housekeeper would supervise a team of maids. These maids cleaned common areas and provided housekeeping services to residents who wanted them. A laundress would manage laundry facilities with her own staff. Laundry service would be available to all residents. Soiled items would be collected, washed, and returned clean and pressed. The basement housed workshops for various craftsmen. A gentleman's tailor maintained a shop where he could make or alter clothing. A house carpenter stood ready to build custom cabinets or repair damaged woodwork. 2 house painters kept the building freshly painted inside and out. A cabinet maker could create furniture or built-in fixtures. A licensed electrician would maintain the building's electrical systems. A plumber would handle all water and drainage issues. A glazier would repair or replace broken windows. Every type of maintenance need had a specialist assigned to handle it. The upper floors housed the staff who made this lifestyle possible. The 8th floor contained quarters for personal servants employed by individual families. It also had communal dormitories for staff who worked for the building itself. There were separate facilities for men and women, each with shared bathrooms. The 9th floor held laundry facilities. Large tubs and drying areas occupied this space. Staff would wash and iron linens and clothing here. Drying areas extended onto portions of the roof where wind and sun could speed the process. Even the roof offered amenities. Children's play areas occupied parts of the upper level. Young residents could play outside safely without leaving the building. Parents did not have to worry about street traffic or the rough neighborhood. The roof provided protected outdoor space in a location that lacked parks or playgrounds. Some accounts mention promenades on the roof with gazebos and covered seating areas. From this height, residents could enjoy views across Central Park and the developing city. They could take the air without descending to street level. The roof became an extension of the living space. On the adjacent lot to the west, above the power plant, Clark planned recreational facilities. Tennis courts would allow residents to play without joining a club. Croquet lawns provided another pastime. Gardens would offer pleasant walking areas. The Dakota's residents would have access to outdoor activities without leaving their property. The heating system was particularly advanced for its time. Steam radiators in every apartment would provide warmth from a central source. Residents would never need to worry about coal deliveries or furnace maintenance. The temperature in their homes would be regulated by building staff. All they had to do was adjust a valve on their radiator. This eliminated one of the great burdens of mansion living. Heating a large private home required constant attention. Furnaces had to be fed coal regularly. Ashes had to be removed. The system had to be monitored to prevent fires. Wealthy families employed men specifically to manage their heating systems. The Dakota made all of this unnecessary. The power plant that provided this heat sat in a separate structure on the adjacent lot. If the boilers exploded, as steam engines occasionally did, the damage would not directly threaten the apartments. This placement reflected both good engineering and psychological insight. Clark knew that residents needed reassurance before they would trust their safety to such systems. The same power plant would eventually generate electricity for lighting. At the time the Dakota opened, gas lighting was still standard, but Clark anticipated that electricity would become common. He designed the building to accommodate electric lights when they became available. Within a few years, the Dakota had electricity throughout. Hydraulic elevators carried residents between floors. These elevators used water pressure rather than cables and pulleys. They were considered very safe. The risk of a car falling due to cable failure did not exist. The ride was smooth and quiet. Each elevator had an operator who controlled its movement with a simple lever. To reassure nervous residents, the elevators had multiple safety features. They would stop automatically if pressure failed. They could not fall. The operators were trained to handle emergencies calmly. Within a short time, residents who had never trusted elevators found themselves using them daily without concern. Water was available hot and cold throughout the building. This was still unusual in the 1880s. Many homes had only cold running water. Hot water required heating on a stove. The Dakota's central system provided hot water on demand. Residents could fill a bathtub with hot water simply by opening a tap. All of these services came with the apartment. There were no additional fees beyond the monthly rent. Clark included everything in a single payment. This simplified budgeting for residents. They knew exactly what their housing would cost. There were no surprises, no additional bills for unexpected repairs. What Clark had created was not merely an apartment building. It was a machine for elegant living. Every inconvenience of home ownership had been considered and eliminated. The endless tasks of managing a household, hiring and supervising servants, coordinating repairs, dealing with deliveries, maintaining systems and equipment, all of it vanished into the capable hands of professional staff. Residents would pay their rent each month. In return, they would live like aristocrats. They would have spacious apartments maintained to the highest standards. They would have access to services that even wealthy individuals could barely afford in private homes. They would enjoy the pleasures of wealth without its burdens. For families weighing the decision to leave their townhouses, the Dakota offered a compelling case. The money required to maintain a private home in Manhattan could provide access to luxury that surpassed anything they currently enjoyed. Less responsibility, more comfort, freedom from endless concerns about property management. The Dakota promised a better way to live. By September 1884, the Real Estate Record reported that the Dakota would be ready for occupancy on October 1st. Yearly rents would range from $1,500 for smaller apartments to $5,000 for the largest. These were substantial sums, but they included all services and utilities. Wealthy families were accustomed to spending such amounts on their housing. The remarkable fact was this: 1/4 of the apartments had already been rented before the building officially opened. Families had toured the unfinished spaces and committed to moving in. By late October, when the Dakota was fully complete, every single apartment was occupied. Not a single vacancy remained. Clark's Folly had become an immediate success. The building that skeptics said would stand empty was completely full. Families who had sworn they would never live in an apartment were living in one. The wealthy had discovered that apartment living could work for them. The first tenants represented exactly the group Clark had hoped to attract. They were prosperous professionals and successful merchants. There were lawyers who handled complex commercial cases. There were brokers who traded in stocks and commodities. There were merchants who ran established businesses. One tenant dealt in clothing. Another ran a cigar manufacturing operation. A coal mine operator took an apartment. Even a stenographer secured a unit. These were solid, respectable people with good incomes. They were not from the very top tier of New York society. None of them appeared on the famous list of 400 families that defined the social elite. But they had money and social standing. They lived well and expected comfort. The distance from fashionable society still posed some challenges. In an age before telephones became common, maintaining social connections required physical visits. Traveling from the Dakota to the shopping districts along Fifth Avenue could take an hour by carriage. Visiting friends on the east side meant a journey across the park and down several miles of streets. But the tenants came anyway. What they found at the Dakota compensated for the inconvenience of location. The apartments were spacious and beautifully finished. The services worked as promised. The staff was professional and responsive. The building felt substantial and permanent. Living there did not feel like a compromise. It felt like an improvement over what they had left behind. Reports from those early months suggest that the Dakota delivered on its promises. The heating system kept apartments warm through the winter. The elevators carried residents reliably. The dining room served good food. The laundry service returned clothing clean and mended. All the systems that Clark had planned actually functioned. Residents found themselves freed from responsibilities they had carried for years. They no longer worried about furnace failures or roof leaks. They did not have to manage teams of servants. They did not deal with coal deliveries or garbage removal or any of the endless tasks that came with owning a house. The building handled everything. A community formed among the residents. Families came to know their neighbors. They encountered each other in elevators and hallways. They dined together in the restaurant. Their children played together on the roof. The Dakota developed the intimate character of a village within the larger city. Some residents would stay for decades. The Steinway family, whose pianos were famous worldwide, were among the early distinguished tenants. Their presence established a pattern. The Dakota attracted people who valued quality and craftsmanship. It drew families who appreciated culture alongside comfort. Between 1884 and 1929, the Dakota never had a single vacancy. For 45 consecutive years, every apartment remained occupied. There was always a waiting list of families hoping to move in. What had seemed impossible in 1880 had become the most desired address in the city by 1885. The critics who had dismissed the project were forced to reconsider. The New York Daily Graphic declared the Dakota one of the most perfect apartment houses in the world. The Real Estate Record praised both Hardenberg's architecture and Clark's vision. What had seemed like folly had proven to be shrewd judgment. The Dakota proved multiple revolutionary ideas at once. It proved that wealthy Americans would live in apartments if the apartments were fine enough. It proved that sharing a building did not mean sacrificing privacy or social position. It proved that elevator living was safe and acceptable. It proved that professional building management could provide better service than private households could manage alone. Most importantly, it proved that the future of urban living did not require giving up the pleasures of wealth. Apartments could be just as luxurious as mansions. They could actually be more convenient and comfortable. All it took was building them properly and managing them well. The success of the Dakota transformed the Upper West Side. Other investors saw what Clark had accomplished. They recognized that the area would develop. Within a few years, other apartment buildings began to appear. Streets that had been empty lots in 1880 filled with construction. The neighborhood that skeptics said nobody wanted became one of the most fashionable districts in Manhattan. But Edward Clark never witnessed any of this. He had died 2 years before the first tenant moved in. He never walked through the finished lobby. He never rode the elevators to upper floors. He never saw families settling into the apartments he had created. He never heard the critics admit they had been wrong. The Dakota became his memorial rather than his triumph. But in death, Clark had achieved something remarkable. He had changed how Americans thought about urban living. He had proven that cities could accommodate growth without sacrificing quality of life. He had shown that density and luxury were compatible. The building still stands at 72nd Street and Central Park West. More than 140 years after construction began, the Dakota remains one of the most prestigious addresses in New York. The apartments Clark created still shelter wealthy families. The walls he built still stand solid. The vision he pursued against all advice still shapes how we think about cities. Edward Clark had bet his reputation on an idea. He had risked enormous wealth to prove a point, and though he died without seeing his vindication, history proved him right. The Dakota endures as testament to one man's refusal to accept the limits others tried to impose. But the Dakota was only the beginning. Other men would learn from Clark's success. They would build their own apartment palaces. And one of them would create something even more dramatic, more scandalous, and more extreme than anything Clark had imagined. The Dakota proved that luxury apartments could work in America, but it would take another man with another fortune and another vision to push the concept even further. If the Dakota was elegant restraint, the Ansonia would be excess made into architecture. If Clark was conservative and careful, the man who built the Ansonia was wild and unpredictable. And if the Dakota attracted respectable families, the Ansonia would become famous for scandal, spectacle, and the most celebrated performers in the world. The Ansonia rose on Broadway between 73rd and 74th Streets. Construction began in 1899, 15 years after the Dakota opened. The site was an entire city block. The building would be 17 stories tall, making it one of the largest residential structures in the world. It would house hundreds of families. It would offer services that made the Dakota seem almost modest. And it would cost $4 million to build, twice what Clark had spent on his apartment palace. The man behind this enormous project was William Earl Dodge Stokes. He was born in 1852 to one of New York's wealthiest families. His grandfather had founded Phelps Dodge, a mining company that dug copper and other minerals from the earth. The family fortune was enormous. Stokes would never need to work a day in his life, but he was not content to simply spend money. He wanted to build things, he wanted to prove himself, he wanted to create something that would make people remember his name. Stokes was 47 years old when Ansonia construction began. He was tall and handsome with a commanding presence, but his personality was difficult. He argued with everyone, he changed his mind constantly. He made impulsive decisions and then regretted them. His personal life was chaos. His business ventures often failed, yet he possessed genuine vision mixed with his madness. Stokes believed that cities made people sick. He thought that crowded buildings without fresh air caused disease. He was convinced that modern urban life was unhealthy and needed to be reformed. His solution was to create apartment buildings that would be like villages, complete and self-contained. Residents would have access to fresh food, clean air, exercise facilities, and every amenity they needed. They would never have to leave the building if they chose not to. This idea was both brilliant and slightly insane. Stokes wanted to put a farm on the roof of his apartment building. He wanted to keep chickens and goats there to provide fresh eggs and milk. He planned swimming pools and exercise rooms when such things were almost unknown. He imagined restaurants and shops and services that would make the Ansonia a city within the city. But Stokes had another quality that would define the Ansonia's character. He loved performers and artists. He admired singers and musicians. He wanted his building to attract the most talented people in New York. To do this, he designed the Ansonia with special features that performers needed. The walls would be extra thick for soundproofing. Musicians could practice without disturbing neighbors. Opera singers could rehearse at full voice in their own apartments. This decision would shape everything about the Ansonia. Over the next decades, the building would house some of the most famous performers in the world. Their presence would make the Ansonia legendary, but it would also give the building a reputation for wild behavior and unconventional living that respectable society found shocking. Stokes's personal life provided endless material for gossip. He had been married and divorced. The divorce was bitter and public. His ex-wife received a huge settlement that he resented paying. In 1911, he married again. His new wife was Rose Pastor Stokes, a woman whose background could not have been more different from his own. Rose Pastor had been born to a poor Jewish immigrant family. She worked in a cigar factory as a young woman. She was beautiful and intelligent and radical in her politics. She wrote for socialist newspapers. She spoke at labor rallies. She believed in revolution and the overthrow of the wealthy class. How she ended up married to a millionaire real estate developer remains one of the more puzzling stories of the era. Perhaps Stokes was attracted to her beauty and her passion. Perhaps she saw an opportunity to advance her causes. Whatever brought them together, the marriage shocked New York society. A WASP millionaire marrying a working-class Jewish socialist seemed impossible. Yet it happened. The marriage was troubled from the start. Rose continued her radical activities. She joined the Socialist Party and later the Communist Party. She spoke out against the wealthy and against capitalism. She was arrested during World War I for making anti-war statements. All of this embarrassed and enraged Stokes. They fought constantly. The newspapers loved every moment of it. They would eventually divorce in 1925, but throughout their marriage, Rose lived in the Ansonia that her husband had built. The building that housed opera stars and wealthy families also housed one of the most radical political activists in America. Only at the Ansonia could such contradictions exist under one roof. Construction of the Ansonia began in 1899 on a site that occupied an entire city block. The location was better than the Dakotas had been. Broadway was a major avenue. The Upper West Side was no longer wilderness. The neighborhood had developed substantially since the Dakota-approved apartments could work. Still, the project's ambition was breathtaking. Stokes hired Paul E. M. Dubé as his architect. Dubé was French and trained in the Beaux Arts tradition. He understood how to design grand buildings that impressed through scale and decoration. Stokes wanted the Ansonia to look important from every angle. He wanted it to dominate its neighborhood. Dubé gave him exactly what he asked for. The Ansonia would use steel frame construction, a technique that was newer than the load-bearing masonry Clark had used. A skeleton of steel beams would support the weight of the building. Exterior walls would hang from this frame rather than supporting themselves. This allowed the building to rise much higher than masonry construction would permit. 17 stories was enormous for a residential building in 1899. Foundation work began first. Workers dug deep into the Manhattan bedrock. The foundation had to support extraordinary weight. The building would house hundreds of apartments filled with furniture and people. It would have restaurants and pools and machinery. The foundation walls were massive, built to last for centuries. The steel frame rose quickly once the foundation was complete. Workers assembled the skeleton floor by floor. Steel beams were lifted into place by cranes and bolted together. The structure grew at a pace that would have been impossible with older construction methods. Within months, the basic frame reached toward the sky. Exterior walls went up next. The Ansonia's facade would be limestone and brick. The base floors were faced with limestone blocks that gave the building weight and presence. Upper floors used brick with limestone trim. The combination of materials created visual interest. The building did not look like one solid mass but rather like layers of architecture stacked vertically. Decorative elements proliferated across every surface. Dubé designed the Ansonia in the Beaux Arts style that was fashionable at the time. This meant elaborate ornamentation, classical details, and profuse decoration. Nothing was left plain. Every window had a decorated surround. Every corner had sculptural elements. The roofline bristled with dormers and decorative features. The building's most distinctive elements were its rounded corner towers. Rather than having square corners, the Ansonia had cylindrical projections at each of its four corners. These towers rose the full height of the building. They were topped with conical roofs. The towers gave the Ansonia a castle-like appearance. They also created unique rounded rooms in the corner apartments. Balconies wrapped around these towers at various levels. The balconies had elaborate iron railings. Residents could step out onto these balconies and enjoy views in multiple directions. The curved shape meant that no two balconies were quite alike. Each had its own character and perspective. The mansard roof was another distinctive feature. Rather than a flat roof or a simple peaked roof, the Ansonia had a mansard, a French-style roof with two slopes. The lower slope was steeper and contained windows for top-floor apartments. The upper slope was gentler and covered with copper that would eventually turn green. Dormers projected from the mansard at intervals, providing light to the uppermost rooms. As construction progressed, Stokes proved to be a difficult client. He changed specifications constantly. He demanded expensive materials and then complained about costs. He insisted on extra features that had not been in the original plans. The budget climbed steadily higher. Dubé and the contractors struggled to satisfy his demands while keeping the project moving forward. Stokes was obsessed with making the building absolutely fireproof. Fire was a constant danger in cities of that era. Buildings burned regularly. Stokes wanted the Ansonia to be as safe as possible. He insisted on concrete floors throughout. He demanded tile partitions between apartments rather than wood. He specified fireproof materials wherever possible. These decisions added cost but would prove wise. The Ansonia would never have a serious fire. The construction took longer than planned. Weather caused delays. Material shortages created problems. Stokes's constant changes disrupted schedules. Workers went on strike at one point over wages and conditions. The project that was supposed to finish in 3 years took 5. Finally, in 1904, the Ansonia was complete. The building stood 17 stories tall. It occupied an entire city block. It contained 340 apartments with approximately 2,500 rooms total. It was the largest residential building in the world at the time of completion. And it had cost $4 million, a staggering sum that had nearly bankrupted even Stokes's substantial fortune. But the building that emerged was unlike anything New York had seen. The Ansonia announced itself from blocks away. Its bulk dominated the neighborhood. Its ornate facade caught the eye. Its rounded towers created a distinctive silhouette against the sky. Love it or hate it, nobody could ignore the Ansonia. The Ansonia's architecture was Beaux Arts excess at its finest. Every surface carried decoration. Every corner had sculptural elements. The building was a three-dimensional catalog of classical ornament translated into limestone and terracotta. The limestone base gave the structure visual weight. The blocks were massive, carefully cut and fitted. Window openings at ground level had arched tops with carved keystones. Pilasters separated the windows and added vertical rhythm. The base rose 2 or 3 stories before giving way to the brick upper floors. The brick was not plain. It varied in color, creating patterns across the facade. Some areas used lighter brick, others darker. This variation prevented the vast wall surfaces from looking monotonous. Limestone trim continued on the upper floors, framing windows and marking the divisions between stories. The rounded corner towers were the Ansonia's signature feature. These cylindrical projections disrupted what might otherwise have been a simple rectangular box. They created dynamic form. Light and shadow played across their curved surfaces throughout the day. The towers made the Ansonia instantly recognizable. Balconies wrapped these towers at multiple levels. The iron railings were elaborate, with classical patterns and decorative medallions. Residents standing on these balconies became part of the building's appearance. On pleasant days, dozens of people might be visible on balconies at various heights, creating a scene of urban life displayed vertically. The building's scale was overwhelming at street level. Looking up at 17 stories of ornate facade, one felt small. The Ansonia did not whisper its presence. It shouted. This was intentional. Stokes wanted a building that commanded attention and respect. The main entrance on Broadway was suitably grand. Double doors of bronze and glass led into the lobby. Above the doors, limestone carvings depicted classical figures. An awning protected arriving residents from rain. Doormen in uniform stood ready to assist. The entrance announced that this was a building of importance. Inside, the lobby continued the theme of excessive decoration. The floors were marble in geometric patterns. The walls featured paneling and decorative plasterwork. Columns rose to support an elaborate ceiling. Palm trees in large pots added an exotic touch. The lobby felt more like a luxury hotel than an apartment building. This was exactly what Stokes intended. The corridors on each floor were wide and well lit. Windows at the ends provided natural light. The walls were plaster painted in neutral tones. The floors were tile or hardwood depending on the location. Everything was maintained to high standards. The Ansonia might be eccentric, but it was not shabby. Light wells penetrated the center of the building. These were open spaces extending from ground level to the roof. Apartments around these light wells had windows facing inward. The light wells provided natural light and ventilation to interior spaces. They were necessary because the building was so large. Without them, many rooms would have had no windows at all. The Ansonia's apartments varied dramatically in size and layout. The smallest had perhaps 4 rooms. The largest had 14 or more. There were apartments with 2 bedrooms and apartments with 6. There were layouts suited for single people and layouts designed for large families with many servants. Stokes had tried to accommodate every possible need. Corner apartments in the towers had curved walls following the building's exterior. This created unusual room shapes. Some people loved the distinctive character. Others found the curves awkward for furniture placement. Either way, the tower apartments were unique. Many apartments had multiple exposures. Windows on 2 or even 3 sides provided excellent light and cross ventilation. Before air conditioning existed, cross ventilation was crucial for comfort in summer. The Ansonia's design considered this carefully. Ceilings were high, often 10 or 11 feet. This created a sense of spaciousness. High ceilings also helped with ventilation. Hot air could rise away from the living level. Rooms felt less stuffy than they would with lower ceilings. The soundproofing was exceptional. Stokes had insisted on thick walls between apartments. He knew that musicians would live in the building. They needed to practice without disturbing neighbors. The construction included special insulation and double wall systems in some areas. The Ansonia was one of the quietest large buildings in New York despite housing hundreds of families. The services and amenities at the Ansonia exceeded anything the Dakota offered. Stokes had studied what Clark created and decided to do more of everything. The result was a building that functioned like a small city. The dining facilities were extraordinary. The Ansonia had not one restaurant but several. There was a main dining room that could seat hundreds of people. There were smaller private dining rooms for parties and special occasions. Different restaurants offered different cuisines and different price points. Residents could choose where to eat based on their mood and their budget. The restaurants were open to the public as well as residents. This brought outsiders into the building, creating energy and activity. The Ansonia's restaurants became known across New York. People came from other neighborhoods to dine there. This made the building feel alive in ways that purely residential buildings did not. A ballroom occupied one of the upper floors. It was large enough for major social events. Residents could host wedding receptions or birthday parties without leaving home. The ballroom could be rented for concerts and performances as well. Musicians who lived in the building sometimes performed for their neighbors, but the Ansonia's most famous feature was its rooftop farm. Stokes believed strongly in fresh food and healthy living. He installed a working farm on the roof of his apartment building. The farm included approximately 500 chickens housed in coops. There were goats for milk. There were ducks and geese. The animals lived 17 stories above Broadway. Each morning, staff collected fresh eggs from the chickens. The eggs were delivered to apartments and to the building's restaurants. The goats were milked daily. Fresh milk went to families with children. Everything was as fresh as possible. Stokes believed this was healthier than buying food that had been transported across the city. The rooftop farm created problems almost immediately. The chickens were noisy. Roosters crowed at dawn. The sound carried into nearby buildings. Neighbors on 73rd and 74th Streets complained. The health department received reports about sanitation concerns. The sight of farm animals high above the street struck many people as ridiculous. Newspapers covered the rooftop farm extensively. Some reporters thought it was charming and eccentric. Others mocked it as the ultimate proof that Stokes was insane. The farm became famous. Tourists came to Broadway just to look up at the Ansonia's roof and imagine the chickens living there. Eventually, the complaints became too numerous to ignore. The city forced Stokes to remove most of the animals. A few chickens remained for a time, but the grand experiment in urban farming ended within a few years. Still, the rooftop farm secured the Ansonia's reputation as the most unusual building in New York. The Ansonia also featured one of the largest indoor swimming pools in the city. The pool was located in the basement. It was Olympic-sized, large enough for serious swimming rather than just recreational splashing. Men and women had separate swimming times. The pool area included Turkish baths and massage rooms. This was luxury that even the wealthiest private homes could not match. Exercise facilities occupied space near the pool. There were rooms with equipment for various forms of exercise. Physical culture was becoming popular in the early 1900s. People were beginning to understand that exercise contributed to health. The Ansonia offered facilities that made it easy for residents to maintain fitness. The building housed numerous shops and services. There was a barber shop where men could get haircuts and shaves. There was a beauty salon for women. A florist maintained a shop in the lobby. A pharmacy stood ready to fill prescriptions. There was a newsstand and tobacco shop. A bank branch operated in the building. The Ansonia even had its own post office station. A pneumatic tube system connected apartments throughout the building. Residents could send written messages to each other or to the management office through these tubes. Small metal containers carried the messages through pipes. This was advanced technology for the time. It allowed instant communication before telephones became common. The laundry service was elaborate. Staff collected soiled items daily from apartments. Everything was washed in the building's own facilities. Clothes came back clean, pressed, and mended. Buttons were replaced, tiers were repaired. The quality of service exceeded what most private households could achieve. The staff numbered in the hundreds. There were doormen at every entrance. Elevator operators ran the many elevators required to serve 17 floors. Porters carried packages and luggage. Maintenance workers handled repairs. Housekeeping staff cleaned common areas. The restaurants and food services employed cooks, waiters, dishwashers, and managers. The Ansonia was a major employer. Security was substantial. Guards monitored entrances around the clock. The building had its own telephone exchange with operators who could connect calls and take messages. Fire safety equipment was placed throughout the structure. The Ansonia took the safety of its hundreds of residents seriously. Mechanical systems were modern. Central heating kept the building warm in winter. Hot water was available throughout. The plumbing system served hundreds of bathrooms and kitchens. The electrical system powered thousands of lights. Backup systems ensured that critical services would continue even if primary systems failed. All of these services cost money to operate. The Ansonia's expenses were enormous, but Stokes included most services in the monthly rent. Residents paid one price for their apartment and had access to nearly everything the building offered. This made budgeting simple even if the total cost was high. The Ansonia opened to immediate success despite the economic uncertainties of 1904. Apartments began filling even before construction was complete. By the time the building officially opened, occupancy was strong. Within a year, the Ansonia was nearly full. Families discovered that the building's unusual features were actually advantages. The first residents came from varied backgrounds. Some were old New York families with inherited wealth. Some were successful businessmen who had made money in trade or industry. Some were professionals, doctors and lawyers with excellent incomes, and some were performers drawn by the building's reputation as a place where artists were welcome. The performers made the Ansonia legendary. The soundproof walls that Stokes had installed attracted musicians and singers who needed to practice. Opera singers could rehearse at full volume without disturbing anyone. Pianists could play for hours. Violinists could work on difficult passages. The Ansonia became known as the building where serious musicians lived. Enrico Caruso moved into the Ansonia in the early 1900s. Caruso was the most famous opera singer in the world. His voice was spectacular, powerful enough to fill opera houses without amplification. He recorded extensively, making him one of the first recording stars. Having Caruso as a resident gave the Ansonia enormous prestige in musical circles. Other opera stars followed. Lily Pons, a French soprano famous for her coloratura singing, lived in the Ansonia. Ezio Pinza, an Italian bass who sang at the Metropolitan Opera for decades, kept an apartment there. Loritz Melchior, the great Wagnerian tenor, was a resident. The list of opera singers who lived in the building at various times would fill pages. Conductors were drawn to the Ansonia as well. Arturo Toscanini, considered by many the greatest conductor of his era, lived there. Leopold Stokowski, who led the Philadelphia Orchestra to international fame, had an apartment. Igor Stravinsky, the revolutionary composer and conductor, stayed at the Ansonia during his visits to New York. Baseball star Babe Ruth lived in the Ansonia during the 1920s. Ruth was the most famous athlete in America. He played for the New York Yankees and revolutionized baseball with his powerful hitting. Ruth loved the Ansonia's location close to restaurants and nightlife. He loved the building's permissive atmosphere where nobody judged his wild behavior. Writers and journalists found the Ansonia attractive as well. Theodore Dreiser, one of America's most important novelists, lived there. Zane Grey, who wrote popular westerns, kept an apartment. Numerous Broadway personalities, including producers and actors, made the Ansonia their home. The building developed a reputation as a place where interesting things happened. The concentration of talented, creative people created energy. Residents encountered famous performers in elevators and lobbies. Impromptu concerts occurred in apartments. Parties could extend late into the night because the soundproofing meant nobody complained about noise. This atmosphere attracted some residents and repelled others. Conventional families who valued quiet and order found the Ansonia too lively, but people who enjoyed stimulation and activity loved it. The building was never boring. There was always something happening. Rent levels at the Ansonia ranged from reasonable to expensive depending on apartment size. A modest 4-room apartment might rent for $1,200 per year. A large apartment with many rooms could cost $6,000 or more. These prices were comparable to the Dakota and other luxury buildings. But the Ansonia offered something the Dakota did not. It offered excitement. It offered the chance to live among the most celebrated performers in the world. It offered an atmosphere of artistic freedom and social permissiveness that was rare in early 20th century New York. This freedom came with a price. The Ansonia developed a reputation for scandalous behavior. There were wild parties. There were affairs and romantic entanglements. There were conflicts and dramas that became public knowledge. The building appeared in gossip columns regularly. The scandals at the Ansonia were numerous and well publicized. Some involved the building's owner, others involved residents. Together, they made the Ansonia famous for reasons beyond its architecture and services. William Stokes's personal life provided endless material for newspapers. His marriage to Rose Pastor Stokes was controversial from the start. New York society could not believe that a millionaire had married a socialist activist from a poor immigrant background. The newspapers covered their relationship extensively. Rose continued her political work after marriage. She spoke at rallies for workers' rights. She wrote articles attacking capitalism and the wealthy class. This included attacking people exactly like her husband. Stokes was furious and embarrassed. They fought constantly about her activities. During World War I, Rose was arrested for making anti-war statements. She opposed American involvement in the war. She spoke out against the government's policies. Federal authorities charged her with violating laws against sedition. The trial was a national sensation. Rose was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison, though the conviction was later overturned on appeal. Throughout all of this, she continued living in the Ansonia. The building that housed wealthy conservatives also housed one of America's most radical political figures. Stokes hated the attention her activities brought, but he could not control her. The marriage deteriorated steadily until they divorced in 1925. Stokes had other legal troubles as well. He fought constantly with business partners and contractors. He sued and was sued regularly. His lawsuits filled newspaper pages. Some involved the Ansonia directly. He fought with former managers over contracts. He disputed bills from suppliers. He seemed unable to avoid conflict. The Ansonia itself became associated with scandal. In 1918, an opera singer shot her husband in their Ansonia apartment. She claimed self-defense. The trial became a sensation. Newspapers covered every detail. The jury eventually acquitted her. She continued living in the Ansonia as though nothing had happened. During Prohibition in the 1920s, alcohol flowed freely in the Ansonia despite legal bans. Speakeasies operated in apartments. Bootleggers delivered liquor regularly. Police raided the building occasionally but seemed unable to stop the activity. The Ansonia gained a reputation as a place where prohibition rules did not apply. Gambling was rumored to take place in private apartments. High-stakes card games reportedly attracted wealthy men from across the city. Whether this was true or merely gossip remains unclear, but the rumors contributed to the building's reputation as a place where rules were flexible. Prostitution was alleged as well. Some claimed that certain apartments served as high-class brothels. Police investigated these claims occasionally but made few arrests. The stories persisted for years. Whether they were true or simply reflected the building's general reputation for permissive behavior is difficult to determine. In 1926, a Scandal magazine published an article calling the Ansonia the Citadel of Sin. The article alleged all manner of improprieties. It claimed the building was home to adultery, gambling, bootlegging, and worse. Residents were outraged. Many threatened to sue. The building's management did sue, but the damage to the Ansonia's reputation was done. Respectable families began avoiding the building. Parents did not want their daughters living in a place with such a reputation. Conservative business people looked elsewhere for apartments. The Ansonia's tenant base shifted even more toward performers and artists and people who did not care about conventional respectability. Stokes lost financial control of the building in the 1920s. He had borrowed heavily to build the Ansonia and to maintain it. The operating costs were enormous. When economic problems hit after World War I, Stokes could not keep up with mortgage payments. The building went through foreclosure. New owners took control. Stokes's grand dream slipped from his grasp. He died in 1926, largely forgotten and nearly broke. The fortune he had inherited had been spent on buildings and lawsuits and failed ventures. His obituaries were short. Most people had stopped paying attention to him years earlier. The Ansonia outlived him, but it was no longer his. Despite the scandals, or perhaps because of them, the Ansonia remained popular with certain groups. Musicians and performers still flocked there. The building's artistic reputation survived all the gossip. If anything, the scandals made it more attractive to people who rejected conventional society. The Ansonia proved that luxury apartments could be exciting and dynamic rather than merely comfortable. It showed that apartment buildings could have distinct personalities. It demonstrated that not all wealthy people wanted the same kind of environment. Some wanted quiet elegance like the Dakota offered. Others wanted the energy and freedom that only the Ansonia provided. The Ansonia represented a different vision of apartment living than the Dakota. Where Clark had created order and system, Stokes created chaos and possibility. Where the Dakota maintained respectability, the Ansonia embraced scandal. Where Clark's building attracted stable families, Stokes's building drew creative souls and wild characters. Both approaches worked. Both buildings succeeded in attracting tenants and generating income. Both proved that luxury apartments had a permanent place in American cities. But they proved it in completely different ways. The Ansonia showed that apartment buildings could be spectacles. They could make statements. They could be destinations rather than just addresses. The building's excess and drama and larger-than-life quality made it famous in ways the quietly elegant Dakota never was. Stokes had created something unique. Whether he had created something good is a different question. He built the largest residential building in the world. He filled it with services and amenities that amazed visitors. He attracted the most celebrated performers of his generation. But he also created a building associated with scandal and questionable behavior. He made the Ansonia famous but also notorious. In the end, the building survived its creator. Long after Stokes died broke and forgot, the Ansonia continued to house residents. It continued to attract musicians and artists. It continued to be one of the most distinctive buildings in New York. The vision outlasted the man, even if the man never quite achieved what he hoped. The Ansonia proved that there was room in New York for different kinds of luxury. Not everyone wanted the same thing. Some wanted order, others wanted freedom. Some wanted quiet, others wanted excitement. The city was large enough and diverse enough to accommodate both visions. But there would be one more great apartment building that would combine lessons from both predecessors. It would take the elegance of the Dakota and the drama of the Ansonia and add something new. It would become the most exclusive address in all of New York, a building so selective that even the famous were rejected. That building was the San Remo, and its story would complete the transformation of how wealthy Americans chose to live. The San Remo represented the perfection of everything that had come before. It combined the elegance of the Dakota with the dramatic presence of the Ansonia, but it added something neither predecessor possessed. It added selectivity so extreme that wealth alone could not guarantee admission. The San Remo would become the most exclusive address in New York, a building where even the famous were routinely rejected. Construction began in 1929 on Central Park West between 74th and 75th Streets. The timing could not have been worse. In October of that year, the stock market crashed. The Great Depression began. Luxury apartments suddenly seemed like relics of a vanished age. But the men who built the San Remo refused to stop. They believed in quality. They believed their building would succeed despite economic catastrophe. And they were proven right. The builders were two brothers named Leo and Alexander Bing. They were born in New York to a family of German Jewish immigrants. Their father had been moderately successful in business. The brothers started as small builders in the 1910s. By the 1920s, they had become major developers known for quality work. The Bing brothers were different from both Edward Clark and William Stokes. They were not eccentric visionaries. They were not driven by radical ideas about healthy living or social reform. They were businessmen who believed that good design and solid construction would always find buyers. They built carefully. They maintained their buildings well. They treated tenants fairly. Their reputation was spotless. Leo Bing was the older brother and the public face of the partnership. He was quiet and dignified. He dressed conservatively. He avoided publicity. He let his buildings speak for themselves. Alexander handled more of the financial details and construction management. Together, they made an effective team. By 1929, the Bings had built numerous apartment buildings across Manhattan. All were well designed and well maintained. Tenants stayed for years. The buildings maintained their value. The Bings had proven they understood the apartment business better than almost anyone. When they purchased the site on Central Park West, they knew exactly what they wanted. They wanted to create a building that would be an instant landmark. They wanted architecture that would define that stretch of the park for generations. They wanted apartments so fine that wealthy families would compete to live there. For their architect, they chose Emery Roth. Roth was born in Hungary in 1871 and came to America as a young man. He had worked for several architectural firms before opening his own practice. By the 1920s, he was the most sought-after designer of luxury apartments in New York. His buildings combined classical elegance with modern efficiency. Roth understood what wealthy tenants wanted. He knew how to design apartments that felt spacious even on relatively modest floor plans. He knew how to arrange rooms for maximum light and minimum wasted space. He knew how to create buildings that looked impressive without being overwhelming. The Bings hired him because he was the best at what he did. Together, the Bings and Roth would create something that had never existed before. Not just another luxury apartment building, but a work of architecture that would become one of New York's most recognizable icons. The Twin Towers of the San Remo would define Central Park West the way the Empire State Building would define Midtown. Construction began in early 1929 before the stock market crash. The site occupied the full block front on Central Park West. The Bings had purchased land that extended back toward Columbus Avenue. This gave them room to build deep, creating apartments with good proportions and ample space. Emery Roth designed the San Remo in the Italian Renaissance style, but this was Renaissance interpreted for the 20th century. The building would have classical proportions and decorative elements, but it would also be thoroughly modern in its construction and systems. Steel frame construction would support the structure. Modern elevators and plumbing would serve the apartments. The design would honor tradition while embracing progress. The most distinctive feature was the Twin Towers. Rather than creating one tall structure, Roth designed a building that rose to 17 floors as a solid mass. Then at that height, two separate towers rose another 10 stories. Each tower was positioned at a corner of the building facing the park. The towers were cylindrical, topped with circular temple-like structures. This twin tower design was brilliant for several reasons. It gave more apartments spectacular park views. A single tower would have provided prime exposures only on one side. Twin towers created two sets of premium apartments. The design also distributed weight better across the foundation. And most importantly, it created a memorable silhouette against the sky. The towers were crowned with circular colonnades, structures that resembled Greek or Roman temples. These temple crowns had columns all the way around supporting copper roofs. The copper would eventually turn green from weathering, creating the distinctive appearance that New Yorkers would come to know. The towers looked like ancient temples lifted high above the city. Foundation work proceeded through the spring and summer of 1929. Workers dug deep into the bedrock. The foundation walls were massive. They had to support 27 stories of steel, concrete, brick, and stone. The foundation also had to accommodate the building's mechanical systems. Boilers, water tanks, and pumps all needed space below ground. The steel frame rose quickly once the foundation was complete. This was standard practice by 1929. Steel frame construction was well understood and efficient. Workers assembled the skeleton floor by floor. By October, when the stock market crashed, the frame had reached substantial height. The crash created immediate problems. Building materials became harder to obtain. Some suppliers went out of business. Credit became scarce. Workers worried about being paid. Some left to find more secure employment. The Bings faced pressure to stop construction and cut their losses, but they refused. They had committed to building the San Remo. They believed New York would recover. They believed that quality would always find a market. They continued construction through the winter of 1929 and into 1930. It was an act of remarkable faith or remarkable stubbornness depending on one's perspective. The exterior walls went up through early 1930. The San Remo's facade was brick in varied tones. Roth used different colors of brick to create subtle patterns. The base of the building was limestone, giving it visual weight. Limestone trim continued on upper floors, framing windows and marking divisions between levels. The brick quality was exceptional. Each brick was inspected before being set. The mortar was carefully mixed and applied. The masons were skilled craftsmen who took pride in their work. The Bings insisted on the highest standards despite economic pressures. Window openings were carefully proportioned. The windows themselves were large, providing maximum light to apartments, but they were not so large that they made the facade look busy or chaotic. Everything was balanced. Every element contributed to the overall composition. The Twin Towers rose last. Their circular form required special attention from the masons. Bricks had to be cut to follow the curves. The work was slow and difficult, but the result was worth the effort. The towers created exactly the distinctive profile that Roth and the Bings had envisioned. The temple crowns atop the towers were the final elements. Workers installed columns that were actually hollow metal tubes covered with decorative material. These columns supported copper roofs that would weather to green. The crowns were lit at night, making the towers visible from great distances across the city. By late 1930, the San Remo was complete. The total cost was approximately $10 million. This was an enormous sum during the Depression. Many people thought the Bings were insane to spend so much when the economy was collapsing. But the building that emerged justified every dollar. The San Remo was instantly recognized as a masterpiece. Architectural critics praised its proportions and details. The public loved the Twin Towers. The building became a landmark the moment it opened. Against all odds, in the worst economic crisis in American history, the Bings had created something magnificent. The San Remo's architecture was Italian Renaissance filtered through modern sensibility. Emery Roth had studied classical architecture extensively. He understood the principles of proportion and rhythm that made Renaissance buildings beautiful, but he also understood modern needs and modern construction. The building's base was limestone, massive blocks carefully fitted together. The limestone gave the structure visual weight. It announced that this was a substantial, permanent building. The base rose 3 or 4 stories before brick took over on the upper floors. The brick facade was not uniform in color. Roth used several shades, ranging from light tan to darker brown. This variation created subtle patterns across the wall surfaces. The eye could follow these patterns up the facade. The building did not look like one solid block, but rather like a composition of related elements. Window openings were framed with limestone trim. Each window had a decorated surround, but the decoration was restrained compared to the Ansonia's excessive ornament. Roth used just enough detail to add interest without overwhelming the composition. Every element served the overall design. The setbacks at the 17th floor created terraces for some apartments. These outdoor spaces were rare luxuries. Residents could step outside without leaving their homes. The terraces faced Central Park, providing spectacular views. Some residents created gardens on their terraces, adding greenery high above the street. The Twin Towers were the San Remo's signature element. They rose from the corners of the building facing the park. Each tower was slightly different in detail, though similar in overall form. This prevented the composition from feeling too symmetrical or mechanical. The circular form of the towers created unusual spaces inside. Apartments in the towers had curved walls following the exterior. Some rooms were wedge-shaped. This created unique layouts that some people loved and others found awkward. Either way, tower apartments were distinctive. The temple crowns were masterpieces of design. The circular colonnades had columns spaced evenly around the circumference. The columns supported copper roofs with conical shapes. As the copper weathered to green, the contrast with the lighter-colored building below became more pronounced. At night, lights illuminated the temple crowns. They glowed against the dark sky. The towers became beacons visible across the Upper West Side. They helped orient people trying to find their way in the neighborhood. The lit towers became one of New York's most recognized nighttime sights. The The Central Park West frontage was symmetrical and dignified. The main entrance was centered on the facade. A bronze and glass door system provided access. An awning protected arriving residents from weather. The entrance announced quality without shouting about it. The building's scale was impressive without being overwhelming. At 27 stories it was tall, but the proportions kept it from feeling like a giant box. The setbacks and the towers broke up the mass. The building felt substantial but not oppressive. Roth had achieved something difficult. He had created a building that was immediately recognizable but also timeless. The San Remo did not look like it was trying too hard, it simply looked right. This was the mark of great architecture. The building seemed inevitable, as though it had always been there and always would be. Inside the San Remo, Emery Roth applied the same principles of quality and restraint. The lobby was impressive without being overwhelming. Marble floors created a sense of luxury. Wood paneling added warmth. The space felt like an elegant club rather than a hotel. The elevator banks were positioned logically. Residents could reach their apartments quickly without wandering through corridors. The elevators themselves were paneled in wood with brass fixtures. Operators in uniform ran them, greeting residents by name. The corridors on each floor were well lit and properly proportioned. Windows at the ends provided natural light during the day. The walls were plastered and painted in neutral colors. The floors were tile or hardwood. Everything was maintained perfectly. The San Remo's apartments ranged from modest to enormous. The smallest had perhaps 4 rooms, the largest had 16 or more. Many residents eventually combined apartments, creating even larger spaces. The building was designed with flexibility in mind. A typical large apartment might include a grand entrance gallery, a living room measuring 30 feet or more in length, a formal dining room, a library, 4 or 5 bedrooms, 4 or 5 bathrooms, servants' quarters, a kitchen, and a butler's pantry. Total space could exceed 4,000 square feet. This was comparable to a substantial townhouse. The entrance gallery served as a buffer between the public corridor and the private apartment. Visitors could be received here without penetrating deeper into the home. The gallery might have a coat closet, a mirror, and a small table for mail and calling cards. Living rooms faced Central Park for the best views and light. The windows were enormous, often extending from near the floor to above head height. On clear days, residents could see across the park to the east side. The views were spectacular and never grew old. Ceilings were 9 or 10 feet high, creating a sense of spaciousness. This was slightly lower than earlier buildings like the Dakota, but still generous by modern standards. The proportions of the rooms were carefully calculated. Everything felt right. Bedrooms were well-sized and well-positioned. Master bedrooms often had exposures on 2 sides. They were large enough for substantial furniture. Many had their own bathrooms attached. Closet space was generous, with walk-in closets that could accommodate extensive wardrobes. Bathrooms were modern and well-appointed. Fixtures were porcelain and chrome. Floors and walls were tile. Many bathrooms had both tubs and separate shower stalls. This was still somewhat unusual in 1930. The San Remo was ahead of its time. Kitchens were equipped for serious cooking. They had modern appliances including electric or gas stoves. Some had early electric refrigerators. There was ample counter space and storage. Service entrances connected to the main corridors, allowing deliveries without disturbing the family. The finishing throughout was understated but of the highest quality. Floors were hardwood, properly laid and finished. Moldings were simple but well proportioned. Door and window frames were carefully detailed. Nothing was flashy, but everything was correct. This restraint was intentional. Roth believed that good design did not need excessive ornament. The proportions and the quality of materials should speak for themselves. The San Remo's apartments felt elegant without trying to impress through decoration. Park-facing apartments commanded the highest rents. But even apartments facing the side streets were desirable. Roth had ensured that every apartment had good light and proper ventilation. There were no dark or cramped spaces anywhere in the building. The San Remo services were less extensive than the Ansonia's, but more refined than what most buildings offered. The Bings had learned from their predecessors. They understood that residents did not need rooftop farms or multiple restaurants. They needed excellent basic services delivered consistently. The staff was professional and well-trained. Doormen worked around the clock. They knew all residents by name. They handled packages and coordinated deliveries. They maintained security without being intrusive. Their presence made residents feel safe and cared for. Elevator operators were equally important. They ran the elevators smoothly. They made pleasant conversation without being overly familiar. They helped elderly residents and handled luggage for people moving in or out. Good elevator operators were valued members of the staff. Maintenance was handled by building employees. There was a superintendent who oversaw operations. There were handymen who handled minor repairs immediately. There were porters who kept common areas clean. The building always looked perfect because staff maintained it constantly. Later, as technology evolved, the San Remo added modern conveniences. Central air conditioning was installed in the 1950s. This was still relatively rare in residential buildings. The San Remo stayed ahead of the curve. Television antennas went up on the roof. Phone systems were upgraded. The building evolved with the times. The Bings managed the San Remo themselves initially. They lived nearby and paid attention to details. They responded quickly to resident concerns. They maintained high standards for everything. Their personal involvement showed in the building's condition and the satisfaction of residents. In the 1970s, like many luxury buildings, the San Remo converted from rental to cooperative ownership. Residents purchased shares in the building corporation. They became owners collectively. A board of directors was elected to manage the building. This board would become famous for its selectivity. The co-op conversion required residents to buy their apartments or leave. Some long-term residents who had lived there for decades could not afford to purchase. They had to move. This was painful for many families. But the alternative was possibly losing the building to developers who might convert it to condominiums or even demolish it. Most residents did purchase their apartments. They formed a cooperative that would preserve the San Remo's character. The board they elected took its responsibilities seriously. Perhaps too seriously, some would later argue. The San Remo's board would become known as the most selective in New York. The San Remo opened in late 1930, just as the Depression deepened. Many people expected it to fail. How could a luxury building succeed when unemployment was soaring and banks were failing? But the San Remo defied expectations from the beginning. The first residents arrived in early 1931. Despite the terrible economy, apartments rented quickly. By the end of the year, occupancy was strong. The building proved that there were still wealthy people in New York even during the Depression, and those people wanted quality housing. The first tenants came from varied backgrounds. Some were old money families whose wealth predated the crash. They had inherited fortunes that survived the economic collapse. Some were successful professionals whose incomes remained stable. Doctors and lawyers still had patients and clients even in hard times. Some early residents were entertainment industry figures. Broadway producers who survived the Depression found the San Remo attractive. Movie people who came to New York appreciated the building's quality and location. The entertainment industry was one of the few that actually grew during the Depression. People sought escape from their troubles through films and shows. The building attracted people who valued quality over flash. This was the San Remo's character from the beginning. It was elegant but not showy. It was prestigious but not boastful. It appealed to people who were confident enough not to need obvious displays of wealth. Rita Hayworth, one of Hollywood's biggest stars in the 1940s, lived in the San Remo. Her presence added glamour to the building. Dina Merrill, an actress who was also an heiress to the Post's serial fortune, kept an apartment there. She represented the combination of entertainment and old money that characterized many San Remo residents. Barry Manilow, the singer who sold millions of records, moved into the San Remo in the 1970s. He loved the building's quiet elegance. He appreciated being able to live in Manhattan without constant public attention. The San Remo offered privacy that was hard to find elsewhere. Steven Spielberg, one of the most successful film directors in history, purchased an apartment in the San Remo. His presence demonstrated that even the most famous and wealthy people found the building desirable. Spielberg could have lived anywhere in the world. He chose the San Remo. These famous residents gave the building cachet, but they also presented challenges. Celebrity residents attracted fans and paparazzi. This created problems for other residents who valued privacy. The co-op board became increasingly concerned about managing public attention. The building developed a reputation for discretion. Residents did not discuss their neighbors with outsiders. They protected each other's privacy. If a famous person lived in the San Remo, other residents treated them like anyone else. This culture of discretion made the building attractive to people who wanted to escape public scrutiny. As decades passed, apartments rarely became available. When someone moved out or died, their apartment might be sold privately before ever being publicly listed. Waiting lists formed of people hoping to buy into the building. Demand always exceeded supply. Prices climbed steadily. An apartment that sold for $68,000 in 1961 might be worth $20 million by 2020. The San Remo became not just a place to live but an investment that appreciated reliably. Owners who held their apartments for decades saw enormous gains in value. But money alone could not buy entry to the San Remo. The co-op board controlled who could purchase apartments, and the board took this responsibility very seriously. Perhaps too seriously, some critics would argue. The San Remo became famous for rejecting applicants who seemed perfectly qualified on paper. The San Remo's co-op board developed a reputation as the toughest in New York. Getting approved to purchase an apartment required passing intense scrutiny. The process was long, intrusive, and frequently ended in rejection. Even wealthy and famous people found themselves turned away. The board required extensive financial documentation. Applicants had to provide tax returns for several years. They had to disclose all assets and liabilities. They had to prove they had liquid wealth worth many times the purchase price. The board wanted to ensure that buyers could easily afford not just the apartment but also the maintenance fees. Maintenance fees at the San Remo were substantial. They could reach $30,000 per month or more for larger apartments. These fees covered building operations, staff salaries, repairs, and reserves for future needs. The board wanted residents who could pay these fees without financial strain. Beyond finances, applicants faced personal interviews. Board members asked about work history, lifestyle, travel plans, and even hobbies. They wanted to understand whether an applicant would fit the building's character. They looked for people who valued privacy and quiet. They worried about anyone who might attract unwanted attention. The famous rejection list grew over the years. Madonna applied in 1985. The board said no. Madonna was one of the biggest pop stars in the world. She had more than enough money, but the board worried about fans gathering outside the building. They feared paparazzi camping on the sidewalk. They did not want that kind of attention. Billy Joel, the piano-playing singer who had sold millions of albums, was rejected. The board apparently had concerns about his lifestyle. Joel had a reputation for enjoying nightlife and parties. The board wanted residents who lived quietly. Joel would have to find somewhere else to live. Cher, the singer and actress who had been famous since the 1960s, was turned away. The board gave no explanation. Co-op boards are not required to explain their decisions. Cher's celebrity alone may have been enough to disqualify her in the board's eyes. Antonio Banderas and Melanie Griffith, both successful Hollywood actors, were rejected despite being married. Their combined wealth was more than adequate, but the board said no. Whether they objected to the couple's celebrity status or had other concerns remains unknown. The rejections created controversy. Some people accused the board of being arbitrary or discriminatory. Others defended the board's right to protect current residents. Co-op boards have broad legal authority to reject applicants. Courts have consistently upheld their decisions as long as they do not violate fair housing laws. The board's defenders argued that protecting privacy was legitimate. San Remo residents had purchased apartments partly for the quiet and discretion the building offered. Admitting highly publicized celebrities could change the building's character. The board had a duty to current residents to maintain that character. Critics countered that the board was too selective. They pointed out that some famous people did live in the San Remo. Steven Spielberg had been approved, so had other celebrities. The standards seemed inconsistent. Perhaps the board simply exercised personal preferences rather than following clear principles. The debate continued for decades, but the board showed no signs of loosening its standards. If anything, approval became harder as apartments became more valuable. The San Remo was not just a building. It was a symbol of achievement. Getting in meant something. Being rejected meant something too. Some applicants who were rejected complained publicly. Others accepted the decision quietly and looked elsewhere. A few tried applying again years later with different circumstances. Most moved on to other luxury buildings that were less selective. The San Remo's extreme selectivity created both benefits and costs. The benefits included stability and privacy. Residents knew their neighbors would be similarly situated people who valued quiet living. The building maintained its character decade after decade. Property values remained strong because supply was limited and demand was high. The costs included criticism and controversy. The building appeared elitist and unwelcoming. Some talented and interesting people who would have been good residents were excluded. The selection process created resentment and hard feelings. Whether the benefits outweighed the costs depended on one's perspective, but the San Remo's approach undeniably worked on its own terms. The building remained one of the most desirable addresses in New York. Residents stayed for decades. When apartments became available, qualified buyers competed fiercely. The waiting list never disappeared. The San Remo represented the culmination of 50 years of evolution in luxury apartment design. It combined lessons learned from the Dakota and the Ansonia. It took Clark's emphasis on quality and service. It took Stokes's appreciation for dramatic architecture. It added the Bing's business sense and Roth's design genius. The result was near perfection. The San Remo proved that luxury apartments could be beautiful without being excessive. The Twin Towers were dramatic but not overwhelming. The apartments were spacious but efficiently designed. The services were excellent but not elaborate. Everything was calibrated carefully. The building also proved that selectivity could be a feature rather than a problem. By maintaining high standards for admission, the San Remo created a community of like-minded residents. People who lived there shared certain values. They appreciated quality, they valued privacy, they lived quietly. This created a pleasant environment that justified the high costs. The San Ramo's success during the Depression demonstrated that quality would always find a market. Even in terrible economic times, there were people who could afford luxury. They wanted the best. They were willing to pay for it. The Bing's faith in their project was vindicated. The building's enduring appeal showed that good design was timeless. The San Ramo looked modern when it opened in 1930. It still looked good 90 years later. This was because Roth had designed based on lasting principles rather than temporary fashion. The proportions were correct. The materials were quality. The details were refined. These things never went out of style. The Twin Towers became one of New York's most recognized landmarks. They appeared in countless photographs and films. They helped define the Central Park West skyline. When people thought of New York, they often pictured those illuminated temple crowns rising above the park. The San Ramo had become an icon, but most importantly, the San Ramo completed the transformation that the Dakota had begun. Wealthy Americans no longer questioned whether apartment living was acceptable. The question now was which apartment building was worthy of them. The standard had been set very high. Buildings like the San Ramo showed what was possible. The story of these three buildings was the story of how American cities learned to grow vertically while maintaining luxury. It was the story of how density and elegance could coexist. It was the story of visionaries who built for centuries rather than for quick profit. Edward Clark had died before seeing his vindication. William Stokes had lost everything, including his building. But the Bing brothers lived to see the San Ramo become one of New York's treasures. They had built something that would outlast them. They had created a legacy in stone and brick and steel. The three buildings stood as monuments to different visions of urban living, but together they proved the same point: American cities could be elegant. Apartment living could be luxurious, and buildings built with vision and quality could endure for generations. The transformation was complete, but the story was not over. These buildings would face new challenges in the decades ahead. They would need to adapt to changing times while preserving their essential character. How they managed that adaptation would determine whether they survived another century. By the 1920s, luxury apartments had become completely normal in New York. The revolution that Edward Clark began in 1880 was complete. Wealthy families no longer questioned whether apartment living was acceptable. The question now was which building to choose. Dozens of grand apartment houses stood across Manhattan. Each one competed for the most desirable tenants. The Upper West Side had transformed completely. Where empty lots surrounded the Dakota in 1884, elegant buildings now lined every block. Central Park West became one of the most fashionable addresses in the city. The park views commanded premium prices. Buildings competed to offer the most impressive architecture and the finest services. The Upper East Side had developed similarly. Park Avenue and Fifth Avenue were filled with luxury apartment buildings. Some were designed by the same architects who created the great buildings on the West Side. Emery Roth alone designed dozens of apartment houses across Manhattan. His buildings defined what luxury apartment living should look like. The peak years were roughly 1920 to 1940. During this time, apartment living reached its highest level of elegance and service. Buildings employed enormous staffs. They offered amenities that seem impossible today. They maintained standards that have never been matched since. Typical luxury buildings of this era had dining rooms that served restaurant-quality meals. They had extensive laundry facilities that handled everything from shirts to bed linens. They employed tailors and seamstresses who could make or alter clothing. They had barber shops and beauty salons. Some had their own doctors on staff. The staff required to provide these services was enormous. A building with 200 apartments might employ 150 people. There were doormen and elevator operators working around the clock. There were porters and handymen handling maintenance. There were cooks and waiters serving in the dining rooms. There were housekeeping staff cleaning common areas and providing maid service to residents who requested it. The quality of service was exceptional. Staff knew all residents by name. They anticipated needs before being asked. They solved problems immediately. Living in these buildings meant never having to worry about household management. Everything was handled by professionals who took pride in their work. Social life centered on the buildings themselves. Residents hosted dinner parties in their apartments or in the building's private dining rooms. Children from different apartments played together. Families formed friendships that lasted decades. The buildings developed the intimate character of villages within the larger city. Architects competed to create the most impressive structures. Along Central Park West, a series of grand buildings rose in the late 1920s and early 1930s. The Beresford appeared with 3 towers instead of 2. The Eldorado added twin towers similar to the San Ramo. The Century and the Majestic created their own distinctive silhouettes. Together these buildings defined the Central Park West skyline. Each building tried to attract the wealthiest and most prestigious tenants. They advertised their superior construction and their exceptional services. They emphasized their prime locations and spectacular views. They competed on quality rather than price. Rents were high across all the luxury buildings. The differences were in amenities and prestige. This was the golden age of luxury apartment living in New York. Standards reached heights that would never be matched again. But even at the peak, changes were beginning that would challenge this world of elegance and service. The first challenges came from economic pressures that were building even during the prosperous 1920s. Construction costs were rising steadily. Labor unions were demanding better wages and working conditions. Materials were becoming more expensive. Building owners found it harder to maintain profit while providing all the services that residents expected. Property taxes were increasing as well. New York City was growing and needed revenue. Buildings that had seemed like good investments were becoming expensive to own. Some owners began looking for ways to reduce costs. The easiest target was staff. Every employee eliminated meant immediate savings. Services began to disappear gradually. Some buildings closed their dining rooms first. Restaurant operations rarely made money. They existed mainly as conveniences for residents. When economic pressure increased, dining services were cut. Residents would have to eat in their own apartments or go to restaurants outside the building. Laundry services were reduced or eliminated. Buildings stopped offering maid service. They cut back on staff in general. Where a building once employed 150 people, it might now employ 100 or 75. The remaining staff had to work harder to maintain standards. Residents noticed the decline but could do little about it. They were renters, not owners. They had no control over building operations. If they complained too loudly, they might be asked to leave when their lease expired. The power remained with building owners who made decisions based on profit rather than service quality. The Great Depression that began in 1929 made everything worse. Many wealthy families saw their fortunes disappear. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Investments became worthless. People who had been rich were suddenly struggling. They could no longer afford luxury apartment rents. Vacancy rates soared in many buildings. Apartments that had always been occupied stood empty. Owners cut rents dramatically, trying to attract tenants. Some buildings that rented for $5,000 per year dropped to $3,000 or even $2,000. But even at reduced rents, some apartments could not find tenants. Buildings responded by dividing large apartments into smaller units. An apartment that once had 12 rooms might be split into 2 apartments of 6 rooms each. This created more rental units at lower price points, but it also changed the character of the buildings. The grand apartments that had defined luxury living were being chopped up. Some buildings could not survive the Depression. They went into foreclosure when owners could not make mortgage payments. Banks took over and tried to operate them. Some were sold to new owners who had different ideas about management. The buildings that had been built as luxury residences were being run increasingly like ordinary rental properties. World War II brought different challenges. Many young men went into military service. Women took jobs in factories. The housing shortage became severe as people moved to cities for war work. Every apartment could be rented easily, but maintenance suffered because materials and labor were scarce. Building owners had no incentive to maintain quality when demand was so high. They could fill apartments regardless of condition. Maintenance was deferred. Repairs were postponed. Paint jobs were delayed. The buildings that had been immaculate in the 1920s were showing wear by the 1940s. After the war, rent control complicated everything. New York City imposed limits on how much landlords could charge. This was meant to protect tenants from exploitation during the housing shortage, but it made building ownership less profitable. Owners could not raise rents to cover increasing costs. The financial squeeze became tighter. By the 1950s and 1960s, many luxury buildings were in trouble. They were no longer profitable to own. Maintenance had been deferred for years. Systems were failing. The buildings needed major investment that owners were unwilling or unable to make. Some buildings became genuinely run down. The Dakota came close to demolition. The future of luxury apartment buildings seemed uncertain. The crisis reached its peak in the early 1960s. Many building owners wanted out. They sought buyers who would either renovate the buildings or demolish them and build modern high-rise towers. Real estate developers saw opportunity. The land under old apartment buildings was extremely valuable. A developer could buy an old building cheap, tear it down, and construct a profitable new tower. The Dakota faced exactly this threat. Stephen Carlton Clark, the grandson of Edward Clark, had owned the building since 1933. He died in 1960 at age 78. His will left the Dakota to the Clark Foundation, a charitable organization he had established. But charitable foundations cannot hold property that does not generate profit. The Dakota had never been run for maximum profit. The Clarks had kept rents low and maintained the building regardless of cost. Under Foundation ownership, this could not continue. The Foundation had to sell. In January 1961, a developer offered $4.6 million for the Dakota. He planned to demolish it and build a modern apartment tower. The residents were horrified. They loved their building. They did not want to move, but they were renters with no legal power to stop the sale. The residents organized quickly. They formed a committee to explore options. They consulted lawyers. They looked for financing. They discovered they could purchase the building themselves if they converted it to cooperative ownership. Under a co-op, the residents would become shareholders in a corporation that owned the building. They would control their own destiny. The residents negotiated with the developer and eventually reached an agreement. They would purchase the Dakota for $4.8 million. Each resident would buy shares proportional to their apartment size. They would pay monthly maintenance fees to cover building operations. They would elect a board to manage the property. Not all residents could afford to participate. Some had lived in the Dakota for decades paying low rents. They were elderly and on fixed incomes. They could not come up with the purchase price. Sadly, these residents had to leave. The building they loved could not accommodate them under the new ownership structure. This was a painful aspect of co-op conversions. The very people who had been most loyal to a building were sometimes forced out. But the alternative was losing the building entirely. If residents did not buy it, developers would demolish it. At least as a co-op, the Dakota would survive. The conversion was completed in November 1961. The Dakota's residents became its owners. They immediately faced expensive repairs. The building was nearly 80 years old. The original hydraulic elevators needed major work. The roof required attention. Plumbing and electrical systems needed upgrading. In 1974, elevator repairs alone cost $500,000. The residents paid for these repairs through special assessments. Each owner was charged their proportional share. It was expensive and sometimes difficult, but the residents remained committed. They had saved their building. Now they would maintain it properly. The Dakota's successful conversion inspired other buildings to follow the same path. The Ansonia converted to co-op in later years. So did the San Remo and most other luxury buildings. Cooperative ownership became the standard way to preserve historic apartment buildings in New York. The conversion process was similar everywhere. Residents had to agree to purchase their apartments. Those who could not afford to buy had to leave. A board was elected to manage the building. Maintenance fees replaced rent payments. Owners took responsibility for preserving their property. Co-op ownership had advantages and disadvantages. The advantage was control. Residents made decisions about their building. They could maintain it to whatever standard they chose. They could control who moved in. The building became theirs in a meaningful way. The disadvantage was cost. Owners were responsible for everything. When the roof needed replacement, they paid for it. When the boiler failed, they bought a new one. When the facade needed restoration, they funded it. The costs were often substantial, but most residents accepted this burden as the price of preservation. The co-op boards that formed after conversion wielded enormous power. They could approve or reject anyone who wanted to purchase an apartment. They set maintenance fees. They made rules about renovations and pet ownership and subletting. Some boards exercised this power wisely. Others became dictatorial and arbitrary. The San Remo's board became famous for rejecting applicants. Other buildings developed similar reputations. Co-op boards in luxury buildings were notoriously selective. They subjected applicants to intense financial scrutiny and personal interviews. Approval was never guaranteed regardless of wealth or fame. This selectivity helped preserve building character. By controlling who could buy apartments, boards maintained the communities they valued. Buildings remained stable. Residents knew their neighbors shared similar values. This created pleasant living environments worth the high costs. But selectivity also created controversy. Rejected applicants sometimes felt discriminated against. Some boards were accused of bias. Legal battles occasionally erupted. The power of co-op boards remained a contentious issue in New York real estate for decades. As buildings converted to co-ops and residents gained control, they sought legal protections to prevent future threats. The answer was landmark designation. If a building was declared a historic landmark, it could not be demolished. It was protected forever. New York City created its Landmarks Preservation Commission in 1965. The commission was empowered to designate buildings and neighborhoods as historic landmarks. Once designated, a building could not be altered or demolished without commission approval. This provided exactly the protection that historic apartment buildings needed. The Dakota received landmark designation in 1969 at the city level. In 1972, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places. In 1976, it received the highest honor, designation as a National Historic Landmark. The building that critics once called a folly was now recognized as one of the most significant structures in America. The Ansonia received New York City landmark status in 1972. The San Remo was designated in 1987. Other grand apartment buildings along Central Park West received similar protection. The entire group of buildings was eventually recognized as defining the character of the neighborhood. Landmark designation brought both benefits and restrictions. The benefit was permanent protection from demolition. The building would never be torn down. Future generations would be able to enjoy it. This brought peace of mind to residents who had fought to save their buildings. The restriction was that exterior changes required approval. Owners could not modify the facade without permission from the Landmarks Commission. If they wanted to replace windows, they had to use appropriate materials. If they wanted to repair stonework, they had to follow proper methods. The commission reviewed everything to ensure historic character was preserved. These restrictions sometimes frustrated owners. Proper historic restoration was expensive. Using appropriate materials cost more than using modern substitutes. Following traditional methods took longer than using modern techniques. The commission could reject proposals and require costly alternatives, but most residents accepted these requirements. They understood that landmark status was what saved their buildings. If their buildings were not historic landmarks, they might not still exist. The restrictions were a small price to pay for permanent preservation. Maintaining historic buildings was a continuous effort. Facades needed regular cleaning and repair. Stone weathered and had to be replaced. Mortar joints deteriorated and required repointing. Metal elements corroded and needed treatment. Windows failed and had to be rebuilt. The list of maintenance needs never ended. Co-op boards established reserve funds for major projects. They planned years in advance for expensive work. They hired specialists who understood historic materials and methods. They worked with the Landmarks Commission to ensure proper approaches. The buildings were maintained better under co-op ownership than they had been under rental ownership. The transformation from rental buildings to co-op ownership with landmark protection represented a fundamental change. These buildings were no longer just places to live. They were historic treasures that residents were stewards of. Current owners had responsibility to future generations. They had to maintain the buildings properly so they would last another century. This sense of stewardship changed how people thought about luxury apartment living. It was not just about personal comfort anymore. It was about preserving something important. Residents took pride in their buildings' histories. They celebrated anniversaries and commemorated significant events. They became custodians of New York's architectural heritage. The crisis of the 1960s led to a transformation that ultimately strengthened these buildings. Cooperative ownership gave residents the power to preserve what they valued. Landmark designation provided legal protection against future threats. Together, these changes ensured that the great apartment buildings would survive. But survival came at a cost. The buildings were no longer affordable to anyone but the very wealthy. Co-op purchase prices climbed into the millions. Maintenance fees reached thousands of dollars per month. Only people with substantial fortunes could afford to live in these buildings. The buildings that had once housed prosperous middle-class families alongside the wealthy became exclusive enclaves of the rich. The diversity that had characterized them in earlier decades disappeared. They became increasingly homogeneous, filled with people of similar wealth if not similar backgrounds. The services that had defined luxury apartment living in the Golden Age were gone. No dining rooms served meals, no laundresses washed clothes, no tailors made alterations. Residents had to arrange these services independently. What remained was good maintenance, competent staff for basic building functions, and the prestige of the address. The buildings had survived, but they had changed fundamentally. They were no longer machines for elegant living as Edward Clark had envisioned. They were simply very expensive places to live with historic significance. Whether this transformation was good or bad depended on perspective. From one view, the buildings had been preserved, and that was what mattered most. Future generations could still see and appreciate the architecture. The buildings still functioned as homes. They still defined their neighborhoods. Preservation was success regardless of how it was achieved. From another view, something essential had been lost. The buildings had once made luxury living accessible to merely prosperous people. They had combined elegance with relative affordability. They had created diverse communities. Now they were only for the extremely wealthy. This seemed like a loss even if the buildings themselves survived, but there was no going back. The economic forces that had nearly destroyed these buildings in the 1960s would only grow stronger over time. Manhattan real estate became increasingly valuable. Development pressure never ceased. The buildings survived because they became even more expensive and exclusive, not despite it. The golden era was over. It would never return, but the buildings endured. They stood as reminders of a time when American cities built for beauty and permanence. They showed what was possible when vision and craftsmanship combined. They proved that great architecture could survive changing times if people cared enough to preserve it. The next chapter in their story would be about legacy and meaning. What did these buildings represent in the modern world? How should they be remembered? What lessons did they offer for the future? These questions would shape how people thought about the Dakota, the Ansonia, the San Remo, and all the other great apartment buildings that changed New York forever. More than a century after the Dakota first opened its doors, these three remarkable buildings still stand. They still shelter families. They still define their neighborhoods. They have survived wars and depressions, fires and storms, changing fashions and changing economies. They endure as proof that vision and quality can outlast everything. Today, these buildings mean different things to different people. For some, they represent history and architectural achievement. For others, they symbolize wealth and exclusivity. For millions around the world, they are simply recognizable parts of the New York skyline. But everyone agrees they matter. These buildings have become more than places to live. They have become cultural landmarks. The Dakota is probably the most famous of the three. Its distinctive profile appears in countless photographs of New York. The gabled roofline and fortress-like appearance make it instantly recognizable. Tourists gather on the sidewalk outside to take pictures. They point up at the building and imagine what life must be like inside those walls. Part of the Dakota's fame comes from tragedy. On December 8, 1980, John Lennon was shot and killed in the building's archway. Lennon had lived in the Dakota since 1973 with his wife Yoko Ono. He loved the building's old-world character. He felt safe there. That night, returning home from a recording session, he was murdered by a disturbed fan. The world mourned. Millions of people had grown up with Beatles music. Lennon's death felt personal to them. The Dakota became forever linked to that terrible night. The archway where he died became a pilgrimage site. Fans still gather there on the anniversary of his death. Across the street from the Dakota in Central Park, a memorial called Strawberry Fields honors Lennon's memory. Yoko Ono funded its creation. The memorial features a circular mosaic with the word Imagine at its center. The word refers to Lennon's most famous solo song. Every day, visitors from around the world come to this spot. They leave flowers, they sing Beatles songs they remember. The Dakota's association with Lennon brought it fame, but also complicated life for residents. Fans constantly gathered outside. Paparazzi waited for glimpses of celebrities. The building that valued privacy found itself constantly photographed. Residents learned to accept this as the price of living in such a famous place. The Ansonia has its own kind of fame. The building appeared in numerous films over the years. Its distinctive Beaux Arts facade and rounded towers made it visually interesting. Directors chose it when they wanted to suggest old New York elegance. The building became a character in stories set in the city. Musicians still live in the Ansonia. The soundproof walls that attracted Caruso continue to attract performers today. The building maintains its reputation as a place where artists feel welcome. While it may no longer house the world's greatest opera singers, it still shelters creative people who appreciate its history. The San Remo's Twin Towers have become one of New York's most recognized landmarks. The illuminated temple crowns are visible from great distances. They help define the Central Park West skyline along with the other grand buildings of that era. When people picture New York, they often see those towers in their mental image. All three buildings have been featured in books about New York architecture. Scholars study them. Architecture students learn from them. They represent a particular moment in American urban development when cities built for beauty as well as function. They show what was possible when quality mattered more than quick profit. Tourism has made these buildings more famous than ever. Visitors to New York seek them out. They take guided walking tours that stop at each building. They learn the stories of how the buildings were created. They marvel at the craftsmanship and detail. The buildings have become attractions in their own right. This fame brings both benefits and challenges. The benefits include recognition and appreciation. The world knows these buildings are special. Their historic significance is acknowledged. They will be preserved for future generations. This was not always certain. There were times when these buildings nearly disappeared. The challenges include loss of privacy and constant attention. Residents cannot come and go without being observed. Photographers camp outside hoping to catch celebrities. Delivery people and service workers face crowds of tourists blocking entrances. Living in a famous building means accepting that the building belongs to the public imagination as well as to its residents. The property values of these buildings have reached extraordinary levels. An apartment in the Dakota might sell for $15 to $25 million. The San Remo commands even higher prices, with apartments selling for $20 to $50 million. The Ansonia, while slightly less expensive, still sees apartments trade for millions. These prices reflect several factors. Location is crucial. All three buildings face or are near Central Park. Park views are priceless in Manhattan. The neighborhoods are safe and desirable. Transportation is convenient, schools are good, everything contributes to value. The buildings themselves add value through their quality and history. Apartments in these structures are larger than modern apartments. Ceilings are higher, rooms are better proportioned. The craftsmanship visible in every detail cannot be replicated today. These apartments offer something that new construction cannot match. Prestige matters as well. These addresses carry weight. Living in the Dakota or San Remo signals achievement. It suggests taste and sophistication. For some buyers, the address is worth millions by itself. They want to be part of these building stories. But the high prices mean that only the extremely wealthy can afford to live here. These buildings once housed a range of prosperous people, from comfortable professionals to the truly rich. Now they house only people of substantial fortune. A family with $5 million in assets could not afford to buy into the San Remo. The financial requirements are simply too high. This creates an interesting situation. The buildings are preserved and maintained better than ever. They look magnificent. They function perfectly, but they serve a much smaller segment of society than their founders intended. Edward Clark wanted to provide luxury to prosperous families. Today his building provides luxury only to the very rich. Is this good or bad? The question has no simple answer. The buildings survive, and that matters. They contribute beauty to the city. They provide wonderful homes to people who can afford them. They employ staff and support local businesses. They preserve history. All of these are genuine benefits, but something has been lost. These buildings once proved that quality urban living could be accessible to merely successful people. They showed that apartments could serve the middle of the economic spectrum, not just the top. That model no longer exists in these particular buildings. The exclusivity that saves them also limits them. What do these buildings represent in the modern world? They stand for several important ideas that remain relevant today. First, they represent the power of vision. Edward Clark saw something that others could not see. He imagined luxury apartments when everyone said such things were impossible. He built the Dakota despite universal skepticism. His vision was proven correct. Sometimes the future belongs to people who can imagine what does not yet exist. The Ansonia represents a different kind of vision. William Stokes was eccentric and difficult. His ideas about rooftop farms seem absurd today, but he understood that different people wanted different things. He created a building for artists and performers when other buildings wanted only bankers and lawyers. His willingness to welcome unconventional people made the Ansonia special. The San Remo represents the vision of quality and permanence. The Bing brothers built during the worst economic crisis in American history. Everyone told them to stop. They refused. They believed that quality would endure. They were right. The building they created became one of New York's treasures. Second, these buildings represent the importance of craftsmanship. Look at the details in any of these structures. The carved stone, the decorative metalwork, the carefully proportioned rooms, the quality materials, everything was done properly. The builders did not cut corners. They did not accept second best. They built for centuries, not for decades. This commitment to craft is rare today. Modern construction emphasizes speed and efficiency. Buildings go up quickly using standardized methods. They function adequately, but they lack the character and durability of older buildings. The Dakota, Ansonia, and San Remo show what is lost when craft disappears. Third, these buildings prove that cities can be elegant. Dense urban living does not require sacrificing beauty. Apartment buildings do not have to be ugly boxes. With good design and quality construction, vertical living can be as pleasant as living in a private home. These buildings demonstrated this principle. They still demonstrate it today. Fourth, they show that preservation matters. These buildings nearly disappeared in the 1960s. Developers wanted to tear them down. But residents fought to save them. They organized, they raised money, they took control, they converted the buildings to cooperatives and got them designated as landmarks. Because of these efforts, the buildings survive. This preservation story has lessons for other cities. Historic buildings are worth fighting for. They contribute character and identity. They connect present to past. They show what was possible. Losing them would impoverish communities. The fight to save the Dakota and similar buildings inspired preservation movements across America. Fifth, these buildings demonstrate that adaptation is possible. They have survived by changing while remaining essentially themselves. They started as rental buildings with extensive services. They became cooperatives with minimal services. They adapted to new technologies like air conditioning and modern elevators. They accommodated changing social attitudes and different kinds of residents. But through all these changes, they remained recognizable as themselves. This ability to adapt while preserving core identity is crucial for survival. Buildings that cannot change become obsolete. Buildings that change too much lose their character. The successful buildings find a balance. They evolve without losing what makes them special. These three buildings have lessons for modern cities struggling with growth and housing. The lessons are not simple or obvious, but they are worth considering. First, quality matters more than quantity. These buildings have lasted over a century because they were built properly. Cheap construction from the same era has long since disappeared. Cities that want lasting value should demand quality even if it costs more initially. Good buildings pay for themselves over time through durability and continued desirability. Second, density and elegance can coexist. These buildings house hundreds of families on small plots of land, yet they are beautiful and pleasant to live in. Cities do not have to choose between density and quality of life. With good design, they can have both. The buildings prove this is possible. Third, different people want different things. The Dakota, Ansonia, and San Remo each attracted different residents. Some people wanted quiet elegance, others wanted excitement and artistic community. Still others wanted ultimate exclusivity. Cities benefit from offering variety. Not all housing should be the same. Different buildings can serve different needs and tastes. Fourth, preservation and progress can work together. These buildings were preserved partly by embracing new technologies. They added air conditioning, modern plumbing, updated electrical systems. They did not try to freeze themselves in the past. They remained relevant by adapting. This shows that honoring history does not mean rejecting improvement. Fifth, communities matter. These buildings succeeded because residents cared about them. People formed attachments. They fought to save their homes. They took responsibility for maintaining them. Buildings are not just physical structures, they are communities. When communities function well, buildings thrive. The story of these three buildings is ultimately a story about human achievement. They show what people can accomplish when they combine vision, skill, and determination. They prove that great work endures. Edward Clark never saw his Dakota completed. He died 2 years before it opened, but his building stands today exactly as he imagined it. His vision outlived him by more than a century. That is a kind of immortality. William Stokes lost everything including his building. He died broke and largely forgot, but the Ansonia survives. It still houses musicians and artists. It still makes the neighborhood more interesting. His flawed vision created something that transcended his personal failures. The Bing brothers lived to see the San Remo become one of New York's treasures. They understood that quality and integrity would be recognized and rewarded. Their faith in their work was justified. The building they created became exactly what they hoped it would be. Together, these three buildings changed American cities forever. They proved that wealthy families would choose apartments over mansions if the apartments were fine enough. They demonstrated that vertical living could be elegant and desirable. They showed that good design and quality construction would always find a market. The revolution they represented is complete. Every major American city now has luxury apartment buildings. The idea that seemed crazy in 1880 is completely normal today. Millions of people live in apartments by choice, not necessity. The stigma that once attached to apartment living has vanished. Clark's vision won, but these three buildings remain special. They are not just early examples of a building type, they are masterpieces. They represent apartment living at its finest. They set standards that have rarely been matched and never exceeded. They show what is possible when people build for quality rather than profit alone. More than 140 years after the Dakota opened, these buildings still matter. They still house families who consider themselves fortunate to live there. They still contribute beauty to their neighborhoods. They still inspire architects and builders. They still demonstrate that vision and craft can create something that lasts. The buildings have survived wars and depressions, fires and storms, economic pressures and social changes. They have outlasted their creators and their critics. They have become part of the permanent fabric of New York City. They will stand for another century at least, perhaps for several more centuries. And that is exactly what their builders hoped for. They wanted to create something permanent. They wanted to build for the future, not just for their own time. They succeeded beyond what even they imagined. The Dakota, the Ansonia, and the San Remo will tell their stories to generations not yet born. The gates still open. The elevators still rise. The apartments, each unique, still welcome those who have earned the right to call these places home. The buildings endure. They stand as monuments to vision, to craft, to the belief that great work matters and lasts. In a world of constant change and disposable construction, these buildings offer something different. They offer permanence. They offer beauty. They offer connection to the past and inspiration for the future. They prove that when people build with care and vision, they create not just buildings but legacies. That is the story of the luxury apartment buildings that changed New York forever. It is a story of dreamers and builders, of risk and reward, of failure and triumph. It is a story that continues today in the lives of families who call these buildings home. And it is a story that will continue as long as the buildings themselves stand tall against the New York sky.